Watching Columbus Television. We are streaming on the internet. Download our apps for Android and Apple iPhone and iPad. Columbus Television.
You're watching Columbus Television. Always on COLS.TV. We are streaming on the internet. Download our apps for Android and Apple iPhone and iPad. Stay connected to Columbus by watching on your mobile device or laptop. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Hi everyone, I'm Michael Baltimore, and just a few weeks ago I had the opportunity to go to Georgia Tech for a 4-day conference on future trends in technology and media. And I want to thank the people here at Columbus State University for allowing me to go. And there was a very interesting, it was a very interesting conference, but there were 6 trends that they talked about, and these were themes throughout the conference, the 4-day conference there. And so what I want to do is just take time to talk about those 6 trends and bring those to your attention, and maybe we can have some discussion and talk about those as we go. So these are trends that are affecting our lives every day, and it's going to increase. So it's already starting to change our lives. So let's go through the 6 slides that I have for you today. Now, the first slide, this is termed data tsunami. And what this really means is that it recognizes that we are being inundated with tons of information. We're getting way too much information thrown at us every day, and it's going to increase. And sometimes this is an overwhelming feeling that we have. It's hard to manage even our emails and information, social media, those kind of things that are coming at us. And the question is, how do we cope with that? And so we have to prepare for this oncoming increase in data and information. Now the goal is to simplify the way that we search through and make ourselves understand the data that's coming to us, make sense out of the data. So there's research and innovations that are moving in this direction. So data tsunami. Now let's take a look at the second trend. And this one is called true personalization. This is the notion that it is about leading a customized life, meaning that we'll have our own filters, our own preferences, and our own behaviors that determine what information that we receive. And sometimes this may include getting information even before we ask for it. So, number 3 in these trends, content integrity. Now, this is the term that captures the notion of security, identity, privacy, and vulnerability. More open and cloud computing is coming that will lead to access anywhere, anytime, but also along with that comes hazards. This is going to be a problem, but also an opportunity for new startups in our world, and there's going to be a big new industry that is created around this notion of integrity. Now the 4th notion is something that they called multimedia assumed. And this notion really means that video, audio, and voice will be combined as a service. In other words, it will be combined and it will be commonplace. Now those who can produce quality content will rise to the top. Those folks that can integrate, tell fascinating and compelling stories will rise to the top of this particular phenomenon. Now, there's number 5 in the trends that we've talked about for the outlook on future media, and that is mixed reality. Now, mixed reality, it's a combination of our physical world with our cyber world. It will help us to do things that are now unimaginable. This can be applied to learning, to healthcare, to entertainment, and just the way that we live our lives and get information about ourselves. And finally, a major trend that is looking is coming in our future is about collaboration. And collaboration is paramount as we gather all of this new information, new industry, and it's harnessing the power of many. And what that means is that as we're working collaboratively, in some places with just a few, it may be that we're starting to work collaboratively with many, bringing together many new ideas to create new content, new movies, new digital books, new textbooks, and other creative endeavors. Well, there you go. Those are the 6 trends coming in our future media and technology. And I hope you'll think about those and have a chance to talk about those. Feel free to give me a call here at Columbus State University. I'd like to hear your opinion about what's coming for us in the future in technology and media. Thank you for watching. I'm Michael Baltimore here at coehp.tv and Columbus State Television, bringing you information that you can use. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in today. And I'll see you next time. All right, Greg, we want to continue our conversation from probably the video that we made was 2 years ago.
That's right.
On this notion of looking at multimedia and moving it toward scholarly activity. It still has merit. We're still going to pursue that notion. We want to talk about it today. We want to just kind of rekindle some of those ideas and knock it around. Matter of fact, we have a piece of video we're going to show in just a moment of the first video conversation that we had. So the basic premise here is that there are a lot of things changing in education. Education is going through revolution and changes. We all know that. We can talk about that in other ways. I know you guys talk about that on Education Forum,
right.
For example. So with that change, I think in our teaching, our learning, all of our practices in terms of research and other things, we really need to take a look at where we're going. We need to be strategic in planful about those kinds of things. So in our discussions, we talked about the notion of video production and the creation of video learning moving toward scholarly activity. And when we say scholarly activity, we're going to define that in just a second, but I think in a general sense, we want to make sure that when we put in work, we come in, we do our research, our writing, our reading, our teaching, all of those things, and we come on camera and start to talk about things that we'll use in the classroom, things that we share with others. In a sense, a publication from a video format, that receives the credit that it's due. And I think as we talk about this today and make more of this, make this a little more clear, it becomes important for us to have some sort of mechanism or process to review what we do in the video production side of things, and then have that recognized by bodies that would, for example, promotion and tenure committees and so forth. So that was the basic premise, that if we come on camera and we start working here to develop a piece of work, like a documentary, a piece of a lecture, or a panel discussion, or other things that we do in a television studio from a university side, that becomes helpful to us. It helps our students in terms of that mission. It helps us in our terms of our professional growth and promotion and tenure and other things as well. So that's where we're at, and that was kind of my recap. Now, you may remember this differently, so I'll let you kind of jump in here. The notion of video production as scholarly activity.
Yeah, and I do think it has been a couple years since we first brought this up.
Fast, yeah.
And in this time, as we've played around with some of these ideas in our own work and within our discussions, I think it's become even more important to us in the field. As you opened with, education continues to change in very big ways, as society has. Technology over the last decade, it's no secret, has changed society in multiple ways. It's changed the way we work, it's changed the way we interact as a society, and certainly education has itself been changed by technology.
Absolutely. And still changing, I might add. We're
That's
not
absolutely
really sure
right.
where it's going.
Yeah,
and
that's
right.
an important piece. You know, in education with our students, our students who are going to be teachers, we talk about the fact that in schools, we've got to think about the fact that we're preparing students for jobs that we don't yet know exist. You know, that's very different from 20 years ago. And so it underlies your whole point. We don't know where education is going to take us. We certainly know where we are today as compared to a decade ago, and we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts here in a minute.
Yeah, I would just jump in on that particular point. You know, we have moved as a university, certainly as a college, and other colleges as well, but as a university as a whole, and maybe even the university system, more toward online distance learning, online classes, more teaching online. Now, that's another show for another time to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of that. There's certainly a lot of questions about it.
Sure.
But a lot of that is made up of recording of videos and showing other videos. And I was looking at a class not long ago that actually sends you out the websites to watch videos and then come back and do an assignment in class. So that's, just to jump in on that particular point, there's already a lot of video use. You mentioned in our very first discussion that really the use of video in the classroom was somewhere that started when television started back in the 50s, actually, and has continued to move. I think we need to get and manage this somehow, get a grip on what we're doing with video production that is useful, that is thought of. You know, everybody has a video camera on their phone, recording everywhere now. There's a lot of questionable things, a lot out there. But what we do is with a mission and with an intent, and I think that's what we need to focus on. I'm sorry to jump in there, but when you talked about that change.
That's right, and that's really to the point of, I think, what we wanted to take a few minutes this morning to discuss is how we can address the need for a very mission-oriented, targeted way of analyzing the work in higher ed, the multimedia work specifically in higher ed, and determining what's scholarly and what's not scholarly. Because as we'll talk about in a few minutes, that's critical to what we do in higher ed. It's critical that we produce scholarly work. People outside of higher ed don't understand what that means.
They may not.
The importance of that. After all, don't we just teach classes? But teaching classes is a small part of what we do. And just as we're being asked in K through 12 schools to integrate technology, and particularly multimedia, into our instruction more and more, here at the university, at the university system across the country, we're being challenged to do that for multiple reasons.
Well, yeah,
and we've got to be able to respond and understand how to get good at that.
Right.
And we have to recognize, we have to have a mechanism for recognizing professionals in institutions of higher ed who are good at that.
Yeah, I don't think there's a process for it. I'm not sure that we have the standards even for that kind of process. You know, we talked a good deal in our first conversation about the publication process in print media, that seems to be the pinnacle. That's the standard, that you research, you actually do an experiment or research in some way, or do a correlational study, but you gather data from the scientific method, you write that manuscript, you submit it to a journal, and that journal has to be peer reviewed. Usually a national journal, and so there are always layers of that, but generally speaking, it goes under peer review from experts in the field. You get feedback about that, you make some adjustments, you may have to resubmit, and so forth, until it's accepted for publication in a well-known, well-thought-of journal in the area that and discipline you're in. That's, to me, nothing wrong with that process. That it's stood the test of time, but in some ways, when we talk about the new media that's coming on in education, the things we just talked about a moment ago, that seems to be a very narrow, a narrow opportunity, a very kind of one way to get promoted and tenured, one way to establish your scholarly activity, when I think this paradigm shift that's happening with video production is going to open up this a little bit more. And I'm curious to see how that's going to go.
That's absolutely right. And I think at this point it's important to recognize beyond what we might refer to as promotion and tenure at the university, which is the idea of you being recognized as a professor, say, as somebody that's doing good work in your field. There's a scale you get promoted on, and tenure is the ability to reach a point at which in your career a university says, we will invest in you for life, to have some what we call academic freedom, to do some things here at the university that otherwise might be difficult for you to do. And of course, tenure comes with all sorts of pieces to it, that
Right, sure.
responsibility that we won't get into here. But my point being, scholarly activity is important for promotion and tenure, but it's important for a reason. And one of the main reasons is, traditionally at the academy, we use publications as a way to communicate professionally with one another. The peer review process is all about assuring that what we communicate is communicated, first off, what we communicate is accurate,
Right. Absolutely.
but it's communicated in a well thought out way. And it's one of the main reasons the academy has served over the last couple of centuries, not just in this country, but across the world, as the place where we produce knowledge, where we produce new knowledge and new ways of thinking.
Right.
We've traditionally, over the last couple of decades, communicated in writing these ideas.
Right.
What's huge, I think, where we're at now, in terms of the overused term paradigm shift, I
Right.
think, is the fact that we are now culturally, in multiple sectors, looking at communicating in ways other than writing or in addition to writing.
Right.
And multimedia is the way that we're doing that. And yet we don't have a mechanism right now to peer review our multimedia communications in a way that vets for accuracy,
Right.
but also vets for how well something is communicated, ultimately to help advance our various disciplines. Because we don't have that mechanism, I think it's important, and this is where you and I have come together in the last couple of years, to talk about how can we establish that mechanism, the mechanism for peer review. Because certainly there's ways of communicating something in writing that's good,
Right.
but there's also ways of communicating something using media that's good.
See,
But they're
that's-
not equivalent.
That's the crucial point, I think, here. If you, for example, let's take the writing piece of it. You are an editorial board reviewer for a journal. You get the manuscript, and you're going to spend time going through. You're going to look at grammar. For example, you're going to look at sentence structure. Is this a run-on sentence? Is it an awkward sentence? Is it the wording and phrasing and so forth, as well as the actual content?
Right.
You're going to look at the scientific method. You're going to look at whether the research was done properly. Did they use the right, did they find all the literature that either supports or negates their point? You're going to look at graphs and charts and tables. You're going to use significant differences and whether or not this can be justified, or whether it's a causal or a corollary correlation kind of connection. You're going to go through a long process to vet that, as you said.
Right.
And so once that's done by a group of peers, then and only then that submission moves to an article and actually goes into print. Now, why can't it be something similar for video production? You know, the growth of video on the web is exponential. It is just booming. We're all looking for more bandwidth to get all those videos out there. That's certainly going to be the case in the years to come. It's happening now. And again, we said before, there's a lot of bad video.
Right.
Maybe mostly bad. I don't know. We'll have to see. But there's also some very good presentations out there that do this and would follow in that same model, where there are references that are made that's accurate, as you said earlier. It gets a message across in a way that engages the learner. and so forth and so on. And I'd like to see us move toward our consortium idea that you brought up a while back, of people to discuss this notion a little more and see if there's a way to set some standards into play.
That's exactly right, because what's interesting about where we are with multimedia in this particular topic is we're looking at vetting multimedia, we're looking at a range of things. First off, we're looking at the content, which means you've got to have people, if you're going to do a peer review, that is, others in the field will say, yes, this is good.
Right.
You've got to have people that understand the content itself, but then you have to have people that understand presentation of content within a media format other than print.
Right. Right.
As you said, in print, we look at not just the ideas, but is the analysis well done? Are the conclusions that are drawn well done? What are the veracity of the claims? But you're also looking at, is it communicated concisely? In video production, we have to make the same consideration, but that means we have to have people that understand how to communicate concisely within a multimedia format. And it draws in now. We're talking about, as you and I have discussed, we're talking about drawing in professionals from the arts who understand video, who understand how to communicate using the vision as a modality, who understand ideas around communication outside of the typical print medium.
Right.
Which means, you know, these are reviewers then. These are people that have to come to the table and say, these are some standards we have to consider.
Right. It's about the standards, and I think, you know, you brought that up, this notion of other mediums out there that have maybe some rubrics that do this, because actually we're talking about some performance art, if you will. If you look at the School of Music and theater, and how do they judge a piece of music? Your performance, for example, if you're a musician, you're moving toward a higher degree in music, and your particular degree is performance. So you're going to have to play a passage, just an example, but you're going to have to play a passage for a panel, and they're going to judge your performance on all the various criteria. It might be, if it's a wind instrument, you know, have you made certain moves, and all of those kind of things, out of my field, by the way. But I would say that has some similarities when you're talking about video production, video performance, of ideas, of scientific ideas of in your particular discipline, how that comes across. And again, does it engage the learner? Does it provide something? I would love to see us really converse with other people from many different disciplines and get their ideas about this. Is it a worthwhile idea? Let's just put that on the table. Should we be doing this? You know, that's always that question. Is this something that's going to be valuable and kind of add to where we're moving in education? I personally think it is. I think you do too. But I want to hear from other people as well. So I want to invite people to have a conversation with us about this. And part of this video is really to look at that kind of thing and offer an invitation to people. There has to be some standards set for this. You know, I think about documentaries. You know, the things that we see on television that are well produced, and they have a big budget and lots of people working on things, but they do similar kinds of things. They fact check what they're presenting, because if you put something up there that's not right, somebody's going to call you on that. Right. So just for that small little example, so if you're preparing a manuscript for a writing publication in a journal, as we said, how would you go about preparing that same kind of thing in a video model, in a video production process that it eventually is vetted by a group, a peer-reviewed group, and also then it becomes something that you can share with others. You can use this in your classroom.
Right, sure.
And I know you've done this. I certainly have done this, where we created a piece of video demonstrating a skill, talking about some topic, and then take that piece of video and it becomes part of our course. It's a requirement in the course that students do something with it, engage in the learning process. So I would love to see that entire process move forward, where we develop standards and it's peer reviewed, and then maybe it goes into your original idea of the consortium. You take your piece of video that's been vetted, approved for publication, and it goes somewhere that maybe I can come along and use it for my class or for another. We
Right.
share that information. And those are just ideas. We've been talking about a lot of them.
Much like an article that's
Mm-hmm.
published, and
Sure.
it goes out into the public domain there, where then you'll pick it up
Mm-hmm.
and you'll perhaps use it to make a point in one of your classes
Well,
on a
you
certain
think
topic.
about this
You're not
with-
having to rewrite an article. for
No,
goodness sake.
you're not starting from scratch, but you are sharing that information because there is something about, if you go back to the writing process, if I'm doing a literature review on my topic, I'm going to find articles out there that I want to include in my writing, and therefore I have to reference that to make the point for where I'm going to in my research. So that process means that we are sharing information. I'm using that great article, that one article that everyone has to reference if they're talking about this particular topic.
Right.
And in this same way, it could be that with the video work, depending on the discipline. So
Right.
each discipline may have to look at this, and there may be changes in terms of the standards and how you vet a video in that way. I'd like to hear more of your thoughts about that, because disciplines are different.
Absolutely.
If you
Yeah,
will,
yeah, that's
and
right.
one set of standards may not fit with another.
And we're talking about here really embracing more of a multidisciplinary approach. As I said earlier, now we're going outside our discipline. We're going into the disciplines of media production and visual communication
Right.
and that sort of thing. And we know that there, whether it is, as you recognized, music or theater or the arts, there is a way that people in those fields peer review one another's work to say, yes, this
Absolutely.
is top quality work, this is not so much. Be able to do that sort of thing. In our field, the scientific, so-called scientific positivistic type fields, we don't do that so much. That's not our tradition of peer review. Ours is more based on positivism, what fact is, what fact isn't, how it's communicated. When we're talking about multimedia production, the how it's communicated now takes on a whole new piece.
You're absolutely right about that, and you mentioned the overused word of paradigm shift. That was Thomas Kuhn's in the
right.
History of Scientific
That's right.
Revolutions. Anybody wants to know about that reference and paradigm shift. But there is a notion that we are sharing. You know, they talk about the MOOCs that are out there. These
Right.
are complete courses from these large universities that are online. You can register and take a complete course now. And I say that because I think a lot of what we have done in academia is very closed and not open to others. You will have a hard time. The average person on the street have a hard time to go in and find the articles like we do in our typical job day to day, where we're writing and producing research. We know where how to go about finding that information, but the general population. And what I guess I'm saying here is there's much more of an open approach to education now than ever before. And this particular medium, I think, advances that as well, because we all have those devices that play video. We have the websites and the iTunes and the streaming video and the television and all of those things that we're doing. It allows us to reach a larger market, larger audience who are interested in learning.
Right.
And
right, sure.
not just closed off to those people in the academy who write the article, and by the way, we've done this, write the article, get it through the vetting process, get it published in the journal goes on the shelf, and that's about
That's where it stays.
That's where it stays. And I would love to have that shared to others, but I don't know. I just wanted to bring that side of it up, because I think this is about opening up education in a different way, and that's maybe part of that paradigm shift.
You know, we had a conversation like this a couple of years ago,
Right,
maybe
we
a
did.
year and a half ago.
Yep.
And
have a piece of video. I don't know, we haven't
I was
gotten
going
to
to
it
say,
yet,
I'm
but yeah.
curious, some of the themes we're talking about now are the very same themes we talked about then.
Yeah.
And it's been a long time since I've seen it. I think you brought a
I
piece.
did.
Would
I
it be
do
worth
have
looking
it.
at right now to just react from?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we've aged or that kind of thing, but we won't worry about it. We want to go ahead and play that little clip. It's just a couple minutes here from our original consortium and our idea and our discussion about exactly what we're talking about today. Why don't we go ahead and play that, and we'll come back. Is that maybe this needs a peer-reviewed, an external peer-reviewed approach that will begin to move this toward reaching that scholarly activity that's really acceptable to the promotion and tenure committees and other people that evaluate faculty professional growth.
See, that's exactly right. You know, when you look at the use of video-based media, we've been using video within higher education since the 1950s.
Oh,
since
absolutely.
the dawn of television, quite
Right.
literally.
Right.
And yet, over the last 60 years, we've not created a vetting process, much like we have for print media, the external peer-reviewed process. We haven't created that for video-based media.
Mhm.
And yet we know that as teaching and learning continues to evolve, whether it's for teaching for K through 12 or post-secondary applications, the use of video, electronic media in general, will continue to become more important.
Oh,
It'll
well,
never
yeah.
replace the printed word,
No, of course.
but it'll take a center stage, and that's why we need to provide a system for peer review of video-based media.
Well, it absolutely makes sense. So let's stay with that topic a little bit. You know, we've had so many conversations we in the studio here that we've recorded, people talking about the infusion of technology, online learning, and what students expect in online learning. You know, there are poor examples of online courses, and there are some really nice examples of that engage the student in the process and increase the value and the learning value for the student. And so what we don't have is an evaluation of how that video should look. If you're doing your lecture, if you're presenting a skill or demonstrating some technique in sort of a clinical practice side of things, we have no way to judge that right at this particular point, and as a comparison with the traditional written version of things. So it almost begs the question, why don't we have that? And then what does it look like once we have a process that sounds like to me you're saying peer-reviewed video-based instruction?
Right.
Am I right about that? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
you know, there are some important similarities, what we're talking about then and what we're talking about now.
That's right. I think it underlines the fact that we're continuing to see this as an issue in our field, and it's not going to go away. And I think it's why I appreciate the opportunity for us to sit down again and
Sure.
sort of recap
Absolutely.
the importance of this as a way of then moving forward to do something about it ultimately. And I think an important piece of all of this is for us to sit down with some people from other disciplines to help us wrestle with the idea of how do you judge the quality of a video that's designed to communicate scientific information.
Well, I know I've struggled with some of those issues, just getting faculty and even students to come in and be on video and make a video for their various purposes and so forth. So I have to add that piece to it as well, because when you're on camera, you're putting yourself out there, and sometimes that can have an impact. I think it was a Hawthorne effect back in research, looked that up, that talks about how this process will influence how we are presenting. And so there are some technological pieces. There is an acceptance of technology as part of what we do in our teaching efforts as a professor, as a teacher, as an instructor, that we have to get comfortable with that
Right.
medium. I mean, there's still people out there that only want to lecture. They don't want it recorded. There's a lot of barriers. There's a lot of things that we have to overcome. But I think the good news is that this is a medium that will share ideas. And after all, this is an institute of higher learning. And so we want to share ideas with other people, get them involved. So I appreciate you being here today, and I appreciate this conversation. And you know, we want to reach out to others out there to come on, talk with us more about this idea. We're not letting go of this. We're going to push forward. We probably might contact you as well, just to have a conversation. And it doesn't have to be on the screen in the studio. It can just be a sit-down conversation about these very issues that we're talking about. How do we take what we can create here, much in the same way as a written article, and put it in from the video medium, from this production side of things, and move it toward scholarly activity that helps others, helps the learning process, and really is a part of this new revolution in education. Greg, thank you so much for being here today, man. Look forward to seeing you again.
You're watching Columbus Television. Always on COLS.TV. We are streaming on the internet. Download our apps for Android and Apple iPhone and iPad. Stay connected to Columbus by watching on your mobile device or laptop. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're watching Columbus Television. Always on COLS.TV.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm here with a very special guest to Columbus State University, Nicholas Carr. Nick, glad to have you here on for our interview here at our station at Columbus State Television. You are here on campus to talk about a very popular book that you've written called The Shallows. All right, so this has been a wonderful book, and a lot of us have read it, and we have lots of ideas. I think it's very, very timely. It's giving us a really good a bit of insight into what's happening in our world and how technology is affecting us even at a brain level. So, but as we talk about this, let's begin with this. Tell us a little bit about your background and what you've done that led up to writing The Shallows.
Well, I've been a writer on my own for about 10 years now. And before that, I was an editor at the Harvard Business Review, a business magazine. And when I was there, I started to edit a lot of articles about computers and about the internet. This was, during the first .com boom when everybody was excited about the technology. And I left there, I left the magazine to write my first book in 2003, and that was more about the business implications of computers. And then wrote another book on a broader topic of kind of how the internet was developing and computers were developing. But I'd been a big user of technology, an early adopter of computers and online services and the internet. But I began to notice a few years ago that I seemed to be losing my ability to concentrate. And I'd notice it, when I'd sit down to read a book or a long article, it was becoming a struggle for me. And I kind of realized that my brain, my mind wanted to behave the way it behaves when I was looking at a computer screen or a cell phone screen, when there's all sorts of information coming at you in different forms. And I kind of wanted to be in that state of kind of over-stimulation, over-mental stimulation all the time, and it became I noticed it was becoming hard to kind of turn it off and engage in whether it was reading or just kind of any kind of more contemplative kind of thinking when you're in control of your mind. and so that made me nervous on the one hand, but it also intrigued me as to, could a tool really have a deep effect on how we think and on how our brain works? And that was really the seed of the book. I started doing research on that topic in brain science and in the history of technology, and ultimately it emerged as The Shallows.
Now, so this came from a very personal place as you were looking at and trying to read and concentrate and seeing yourself kind of wandering in or thinking about other things. Certainly when we look at a computer screen now, and by the way, you see ads on the side and you wonder, how did that ad that I'm interested in that product come up on the side like that? There's a lot of things happening here that will pull away our attention and distract us out of that. And it sounds like that is becoming more the norm now. So technology is really having an effect
on how we deal with information and how and learning, I
Yeah.
might say, as well.
I think that's right. And, you know, I think it's both a reflection of the technology itself. I mean, we've designed the internet and computer systems to be extremely powerful suppliers of information, and we constantly want, you know, more and faster, and that's what the software programmers give us. And then on the other hand, it's also in the interests of some of the big internet companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter to keep us engaged and keep us distracted in a way, and constantly looking at the little ads or at other information, clicking on links, because, you know, the faster we move through information, the more ads they can show us, the more information about us they can collect. So it's both on the business side and the technology side. It's a system very much designed, I think, to keep us in a perpetual state of distraction and constantly interrupted. And there's something in us that really likes that.
Right. That's something built into the human nature.
Yeah, and
that
so
is
you see
what it
people
is.
who become quite compulsive and if you look at statistics about how quickly people click on links or how often they check their email inbox or glance at their smartphone, you see it's kind of all the time, you know,
Yes.
every few seconds. And we've created what I think is, in a way, a new environment for human beings. And I fear that we've created this and entered it without really thinking critically about it.
Right,
And
right.
what might we lose even as we gain all the benefits that you get from it.
Well, we had this. Somebody used the term data tsunami. That there's just so much data coming at it. How do we sort through? But we're sort of maybe biologically gearing up for that to a certain extent to begin to go through this information to kind of get what we need at the moment.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, how is that affecting our learning? I mean, there are some topics, especially at a university here, we're wanting our students to have an in-depth knowledge
Right.
of subject matters. And so what do you think is the consequence in that side of it? And secondly, do we need to be looking at maybe changing the way we teach to either adapt to or counter
Yeah.
some of this very almost attention deficit type of issue that's being seen with us, sort of very, you know, shifting through information very quickly, moving to the next
Yeah.
topic, but not staying on topic for very long. So
I think, you know, I do think there is a trade-off going on between, on the one hand, and I think this is coming out of the science. There have been now quite a few studies in different areas of how being online, being in front of a screen, how it affects us. And what you see is that there are some cognitive skills, some mental skills that seem to get better. I mean, it seems like the more time you spend multitasking online, keeping track of lots of information, the quicker your brain is able to shift focus. And the more you're able to keep track of lots of things simultaneously, and maybe even spot patterns in you know, different displays of information.
Right.
And so, on the one hand, those are good
That's
skills
great
to
skill,
have,
yeah,
particularly
absolutely.
today. But what we seem to be sacrificing is the kind of thinking that requires attentiveness, that requires not, you know, taking it all in quickly, but saying, I'm going to stop taking it in for a while and really focus on one thing.
begin to do something
Yeah.
with that and reflect on what you've learned,
Right.
and then make some sort of decision about that, or maybe application to it. But that seems to be missing. So maybe this self-reflection and reflection on the material and thoughtfulness about it is something that we're
Yeah.
missing in this.
I think it
fast-paced
is. And if you look at what we know about our brains, there are some things that only happen when you pay attention, when you do screen out distractions. And I think that's when you really start to develop the richest and deepest kind of knowledge, which isn't at all about finding information as quickly as possible.
Right.
It's about creating associations and connections between all this information, which is a very complex process in our brain that happens when you begin to move information from your short-term memory into your long-term memory, and then you start connecting it with all other things, and that gives you the ability to think conceptually and think critically. And I worry that as we kind of train ourselves to shift our focus all the time, grab new information all the time. We're not engaging in those more conceptual and critical ways of thinking.
That's very interesting. We've been talking here at the university on several occasions about teaching to the student for jobs that are yet to be created. And so, and in some of those conversations, it is about the conceptualization. It is putting the facts together to make a new thought and to make a new process go on. So what would you recommend? I mean, is there, yes, we have a lot of data, and yes, we are building skills to sort through that data now, and that's definitely a positive on some. What would you recommend to sort of take account of what's happening? I mean, you did it originally as you first started talking about. Wait, I'm shifting through this too fast, and let me be more reflective.
Yeah.
So, what would you say?
I mean, we know that our brains adapt to what we use them for, and so you know, it's similar to your muscles. If the muscles you exercise get stronger, the ones you don't exercise get weaker, and the brain doesn't work in the same way, but it seems to exhibit that kind of adaptability. And so what that tells us is that if you want to be able to think deeply as well as thinking quickly, you have to practice both of those ways of thinking. And so you have to create time for yourself where you're not distracted and where the gadgets are turned off. And that's easy to say,
right? Difficult to
but
do,
as most
right?
people know today, it's very difficult to do. Not only because we tend to crave information, but because if your employer wants you to be constantly monitoring messages and responding, then you're under pressure to do it there. If your friends are, living their social life online through texts and Facebook, it becomes hard to disconnect. If you go to university and everything's online, then you have to connect to get material and stuff. So we're creating, in addition to kind of the personal angle, we're reshaping society to encourage people to be online all the time, basically. And so it becomes very, very difficult to back away, even for short periods of time. But I think, I think there's no substitute for that if you want to engage those parts of your brain that are for reflection and contemplation and attentiveness. If you don't exercise those, they're going to weaken.
Right. And so we're obviously exercising the ones that were, as the Shallows points out in your book, that we're going through a lot of information very, very quickly and not staying there for very long. What do you see on the horizon as this kind of moves forward? And in terms of the things that you've learned from this, writing this book and doing the tours and talking about this, where are we going? What do you see on the horizon?
Well, on the one hand, I think we're going in the same direction we've been going, and there's a lot of momentum behind, pushing more and more information onto us and in having us do more and more aspects of our lives through computer screens. And I don't think that pressure to do that is going to stop. On the other hand, I have noticed, and to me this is kind of encouraging, that there is something of a backlash now, in that people are really for the first time beginning to question the hold that the technology increasingly has over them from the moment they wake up and to the moment they go to bed. And I find this questioning of the technology to be happening not only with older people, middle-aged people, but with quite young people too. College students, teenagers even. There's this sense that, do I really want to live my whole life looking at, monitoring Facebook, texting every few minutes back and forth. And what I hope is that discomfort that a lot of us feel, that maybe the technology has too much power over us, will translate into some changes not only in our personal behavior, but in those kind of social processes that push us to use technology in certain ways.
Wow, that sounds very intriguing. So we really need to find a balance between all of this technology and this data that's coming at us to find time for ourselves and be reflective and contemplate.
And find times to have conversations with other people without glancing at our cell phones or our smartphones.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking with you today, and thank you so much for coming in and speaking with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been with Nicholas Carr, who's written the book Shallows. He's here at Columbus State University. He's giving a talk tonight, and so I want to thank you again.
Sure.
And thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to This Week in Space Science. I'm Michael Baltimore, your host here on TWIS, and of course, Dr. Sean Cruzen from the Coca-Cola Space Science Center.
Hello,
Sean, welcome to another episode here in the studios at Columbus State University, and we've got a very special show again today. I can't wait to get into this. So it's good times here, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching us in various ways. Perhaps you're watching us on CSU.TV, ColumbusState.TV on the web, on your Roku player, on iTunes, and other places, and of course Mediacom channels 99 98 here at in Columbus, Georgia. We're at Columbus State University, and we welcome you to this show. Sean, we have some exciting news to start off the show with. We have to go there because this is a topic that we've talked about quite a bit on this show, and I'm really interested in what you're going to tell us today.
Well, it's a fascinating thing, and you know, a lot of times when we do topics on the show, I try to make them timeless because, again, as Mike just said, I'm not sure when you're watching this or in what form of media. We hardly ever go with breaking news, but this literally is breaking news, and I'm going to go ahead and throw out the date. So today is April the 17th, 2014, and that is the day of a very major announcement by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and a team of scientists from a multitude of universities who are working with the Kepler Space Telescope. Today, ladies and gentlemen, has come out an announcement that they have now found the very first ever extrasolar planet, in other words, planet orbiting another star that is both roughly the same size as our Earth and in that very special place that we call the habitable zone, the place where the temperatures and pressures are just right to make that planet capable of supporting liquid water on its surface. And that planet is called Kepler 186f. And today, just literally minutes before I came up here to the studio to film that show, there was a press conference going on at NASA, and they were revealing some of the details about this brand new discovery of a new, what we call exoplanet, that is in the habitable zone and roughly the size of the Earth. So Mike, they finally found another Earth.
Well, you know, we've talked about this before, and there were thousands of planets, what, 1,500 or so, that I remember you reporting on. And this notion is, most of the time, those planets are much bigger than the Earth.
Exactly.
And so this is very different, that it's close to our size and in the same orbital distance, perhaps, from the star. I want to hear more about this.
Well, so let's first of all talk about the Kepler Space Telescope, because that's a good place to go. Now, the Kepler Space Telescope is a telescope that's designed to hunt for planets that are orbiting a distant star that happen to have a very particular alignment. And you can see kind of in this artist's conception in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, you see a star with a white ring around it. Well, the white ring is fictional, but what they're showing is on that white ring, there's a little black dot, and that's a planet. That's a planet orbiting some distant star in this kind of cartoon drawing here. And what happens is that planet is its orbit is aligned just right to where that planet moves in front of the face of that distant star. And the Kepler Space Telescope is designed to identify stars with these planets moving in front of them. And then once identified, the Kepler can measure the parameters of that planet's pass in front of that distant star. So in other words, they can figure out about how long it takes to move across. They can figure out about what its diameter is because they can figure out the percentage of light that is blocked as that planet passes in front of that distant star. And from that set of data, the scientists on the ground are able to say, yes, this is an exoplanet, or no, this is something else, some other kind of phenomenon taking place on that distant star. So through that technique, which is called an occultation or a transit technique, then the scientists at the Kepler Space Telescope have been able to identify, as you just said moments ago, over 1,500 candidates for planets around other stars. And so they're able to say with some certainty that there are that many known exoplanets orbiting stars that are not our sun, other stars in our own Milky Way galaxy. Now, Kepler can't see this phenomenon taking place in other galaxies. It's only looking at stars more or less in the neighborhood of our own sun, at least in terms of the overall size of the Milky Way. The Milky Way is 100,000 light years from one side to the other. And so the stars that we can see with this kind of level of detail really are in our own neighborhood within the Milky Way. The star that we're talking about today with the habitable planet is about 500 light years from the Earth. So on that scale of 100,000 light years, 500 light years is right here in the backyard. Yeah. It's in the very near galactic neighborhood within the Milky Way galaxy. And that's what makes this such a very special and important discovery.
Well, it is an important discovery and very exciting news. You know, we talked about this, you use the phrase Goldilocks zone, the distance from the star to the planet and its orbit there.
Yes.
And I assume that we've started that from our measurements of our own solar system,
That's
from
exactly
the Earth
right.
to the Sun, and then we apply that into any of those exoplanets out there and their stars.
That's exactly right. We have to take what we know about planetary science and we have to start with our own solar system, because that's the one that we can study in the greatest detail, because it's the one that's right here. So we can get the best measurements of how starlight from our sun interacts with the planets and their atmospheres at various distances in our own solar system. Those become the hinge pins for modeling how starlight behaves with an atmosphere of various sizes of planets at various distances from their various parent stars. So we use our solar system as that basis for our understanding, the basis for our modeling of what conditions might be like on these extrasolar planets. And then we scale the starlight up and down depending on the nature of the parent star.
Right.
So if that parent star is much larger than our sun,
Yes,
or
that's
much
a good
hotter
question.
than our sun, then it's going to be putting off a lot more intensity of light, and that changes the intensity of light reaching that exoplanet. If the exoplanet is either much farther away from its parent star than we are from the sun, or much closer to its parent star than we are from the sun, then we have to take those factors into account too. And all of those things I just said are a very important part of the story in Kepler 186f, because you see that parent star is a star that happens to be a whole lot smaller than our own sun.
Oh, okay.
It's a much smaller star. It's putting off much less radiation, and therefore that planet that we're talking about, Kepler 186f, can be a whole lot closer to its parent star than Earth is to our own sun, because that star is smaller and cooler. Now,
that's a nice diagram right
it's
there,
a great
too.
diagram.
Kinda shows
This was part of the material being put out by NASA today, and so we can use this material to show the configuration of this solar system. So first of all, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see a little disk with some white lines through it and a green ring. That is a representation of this alien solar system. Their parent star is the star that's in the middle of all those circles. The circles that we see there are the orbits of other exoplanets in that solar system. And then the biggest circle there that's out toward the edge of that green ring, that is Kepler 186f. Now, why is it called F? Because A, B, C, D, and E have already been found. So there were already 5 other known exoplanets in the system. F was the 6th one to add to that. And so this is the 6th known planet in that solar system. And it just happens to be at that distance from its parent star that's about equal to the distance of Mercury from our own sun. Now, if you look down to the lower part of this diagram, that's a schematic to the same scale of our own solar system. So you can see that Kepler 186f lies at a distance from its parent star roughly equal to the distance that Mercury lies to our own sun. And again, you might think, well, wow, Mercury's really hot. And Mercury's, its surface is being cooked by this, at least the one facing the sun, by that intense radiation coming off the sun at that very close distance. And that's true, but remember, our star, our sun, is a whole lot hotter because it's much bigger than the parent star of Kepler 186 and its system. And so that Kepler 186 star is just smaller, it's not putting off as much radiation. Now, let's pay attention to those green rings in this diagram for a moment. Those green rings represent what we called the habitable zone, or as you mentioned a moment ago, the Goldilocks zone. We call it the Goldilocks zone because it's not too cold and it's not too hot, it's just right. It's just right set of temperatures to allow temperature and pressure conditions on a planet to support the presence of liquid water. And when we look out into these exoplanet systems and consider whether or not they might harbor life, it's always life as we know it is what we're thinking through. And life as we know it requires the presence of liquid water. In fact, it almost mandates, the presence of liquid water almost mandates that life exists, as you know, as far as we can tell.
Right.
And so it's an interesting set of parameters to look at. So within that green ring, any planet that would be at that distance from its parent star would support life. Well, let's look at our own solar system at the bottom. And you see Mercury way too close to our sun. It's too hot. It can't support liquid water. Venus just inside the green ring. But yet that small distance just inside the green ring tells us that conditions are not right for liquid water there. In fact, it's a little bit too hot. And as we know, Venus, one of the hottest planets in the solar system, has the highest surface temperature in the solar system because it has a tremendously thick atmosphere and traps all that heat from the sun. Part of that was because it formed at that distance close to the sun in the first place. Right. So it's outside the habitable zone. In fact, the only star in our habitable zone in our solar system is our Earth, right? So even Mars would be too far. It would be out beyond this green ring and be too cold. So Earth is in the just right location. Well, let's take that knowledge then and extrapolate it up to Kepler-186 and its system. And look where F is. Kepler-186f, sitting very near the outside edge of the habitable zone. What that means is this could be a winter planet. You know, it's in that zone where water can exist on the surface, but it's out at the outer parameters of that. And so therefore, there's liable to be, if there's water at all on that surface, there's liable to be some of it that's frozen. But still, conditions exist where liquid water could be present. So if this planet's going to lean one way or the other, too hot or too cold, this one's going to lean a little bit toward too cold.
On the cold side, yes.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit on the cold side. So it's out of, but yet it's still inside that parameter of the habitable zone. It's toward the outside edge, a little bit too cold, but probably still could support amounts of liquid water. So that makes this a very interesting system. Potentially gravitational conditions similar to the Earth. Notice in the diagram in the upper left, the inset, it's a slightly bigger planet than the Earth. It's close to the same size as Earth, but it's slightly bigger. Yeah. And if it's roughly the same mass as the Earth, that might mean it has more gravity. Now, we don't know these things right now, but if it does have more gravity, it might hold a little bit thicker atmosphere. If it holds a little bit thicker atmosphere, it's better at this process called the greenhouse effect for trapping heat, which could warm it up a little bit more. So maybe it's not quite so cold there because it might have a little bit thicker atmosphere. Now I'm layering on conjectures here. We don't know any of those things. But those are the kinds of questions now that planetary scientists will begin to ask about Kepler-186f. And they will do a variety of models simulating the conditions and what they would be like, both gravitational conditions and atmospheric conditions, along with the heat model from that radiation coming in from the parent star.
Okay, there's an artist's conception. So right there.
Exactly. We are seeing what
almost a point of view, as they call it.
It's a point of view shot. Exactly. We are seeing what this planet, what the surface conditions might look like. If you see the star, notice it's red, and again, it's an M dwarf. M is a classification for stars in what we call the stellar spectral classification system. M is the coolest of all the categories of stars. It's the smallest, it's generating the least fusion, it's putting out the least amount of energy, and so it is among the coolest stars. That's why it gets that kind of reddish color. Right. A lot of people think, well, it's red hot. Well, it's hot and it's red, but red is the coolest color among star colors. Blue is actually the hottest of all the star colors. Okay. And so this is one of the cooler end stars. Again, a kind of a cartoon view here in a sense of those other planets that are in the system right there, in between this planet and its parent star. And yes, well, apparently we're high in the trees.
I like the trees. I like the effect that they put the trees on there with the water and the little in coves and some other things there. But what got me, my first attention was drawn to the fact that there's a Milky Way.
There's the Milky Way. It's
right
the same
out
Milky Way that we're in.
We're in the same place.
Yeah, it's part of our own Milky Way.
Not that far away in those vast terms that we talk about.
No, it's, again, as you say, it's very close to us. It's right in our neighborhood. So it would see a view of the Milky Way reasonably similar to what we would see because it also is a long way from the galactic center. But this is again a conjecture, of a lake with possibly these alien trees and things like that. We don't know those things, folks. We don't know whether it has water or not. We don't know whether there are trees or not. But it could look something like this, and that's really the intriguing part. This could be a location for, number one, liquid water, number two, on a planet similar in size to Earth, and number three, if those conditions exist, conditions might be right for the existence of some form of life on this weird alien world, Kepler 186f, right here in the galactic neighborhood.
Right. Brand new announcement about this, 186f from Kepler. Pretty amazing. So the idea of water on the planet is I mean, that's hard to identify out there, basically. So we're looking at that habitable zone and kind of using that as the predictor of possible water on the planet. We can't read that in infrared or some other scientific way from some other telescopes about water on these planets that far out.
So here are the set of difficulties that are involved. We cannot yet make a direct measurement of surface conditions on that planet. We would love to be able to do that, but things are farther away in our universe than we can really imagine, than we really grasp. So when we say 500 light years, every one of those light years, one light year, 26 trillion miles. So it's a ridiculous amount of distance. So each one of those light years is a crazy distance, and there are 500 of them out to this particular object.
Right.
So there's no way we're going to be able to make a direct measurement. We don't have any instruments sensitive enough to make any kinds of direct measurements of the surface conditions. Now, if we get lucky, we might be able to get a spectrum of light shining through the atmosphere of that exoplanet. Remember, it's passing in front of its parent star. A spectrum means we let that light go through a prism and we break it up into its component colors, and there are features in that spectrum that allow us to identify various chemical species. And so we might be able to pick out the fingerprints of various chemicals that are in the atmosphere of that planet after the starlight shines through the atmosphere and comes to the Earth. So possibly some atmospheric measurements.
Right.
It's not completely out of the question that someday, or maybe someday not too far in the distant future, we could get a spectrum of the atmosphere that might actually show water vapor. Now, if there's water vapor in the atmosphere, does that mean there's water on the surface? Well, not necessarily. So there's a lot of questions to ask there. But you see how we have to kind of stack on these extrapolations. It's not like we're going to know right away whether or not this particular exoplanet does have liquid water on its surface. But it's intriguing for us to be able to identify that very first Earth-sized planet that at least has the possibility of water on the surface.
Right. And there's so many planets, so many stars out there, so many orbiting solar systems out there.
Yep.
But this is the first one we found that's that size and that right distance. It's a pretty amazing discovery.
Here's another couple interesting facts about this planet. So the parent star for this planet, an M-class dwarf is what we call them, that star is a much longer-lived star than our sun. In other words, that M star's lifetime is maybe 10 times the lifespan of our own sun. So this could be a star that's been around for a tremendous amount of time, or that will be around for a tremendous amount of time in the future. Let's extrapolate it backwards. Let's say it's a very, very old star. It's going to be stable in a stable configuration for a very long time. That means that this planet may have been around for a lot longer than ours and have a lot more time for biological processes to take place on the surface of that planet. So that's one potentially interesting thing about it. Here's another thing. Those M-class dwarfs, they're a little bit more unstable in one sense than our sun. They tend to have more powerful solar flares. And since this planet is both closer to its parent star and then the solar flares on that star, at least it's thought by models right now, those flares can be more powerful. This planet can be getting really healthy doses of radiation. You might say, oh, well, that's potentially bad for life. Well, let's say somehow life got going on that planet. Those doses of radiation might actually cause more mutations to occur in any biological systems that can be present, which might speed up the changes of those life forms on that planet and cause changes that happen more quickly to allow development to take place more rapidly. So that's another interesting factor. So do we know any of that for sure about this planet? No, we don't. But we're looking all the possibilities right now, and we're trying to add up all these pieces to say, is this a place where life might exist? Because that comes back to our most fundamental question that we often ask when we look up into the night sky, which is, are we alone? Are we the only living creatures out there in this universe, or places where life can exist at least? And more importantly, are we the only intelligent living creatures? Are we the only ones looking up at all this and wondering whether or not we're alone? Well, it's not out of the question that there are critters on that Kepler 186F doing the same kinds of things and asking the same kinds of questions. Not out of the question. Not likely, and I'm not saying it's so.
Okay.
Not out of the question.
All right, stay tuned.
Very, very interesting stuff. Yeah, we'll know next show. I'm sure next episode we'll be able to answer all those questions.
All right,
in
but
detail.
no, this is good science, though. We need to look at these and look at the possibilities of things out there in that way, and that's why it is so exciting to hear this kind of news. And thank you, Sean, for bringing that in today. Now, there's been some events here recently that you wanted to talk about, so introduce it.
Well, we had something kind of fun that took place over the heads of our folks at the Coca-Cola Space Science Center here at Columbus State University and our Meade-Westvaco Observatory. We do a program that we call webcasting. We have our observatory that we have set up to do webcasts of celestial events, and we do those quite often of a variety of phenomenon. A very interesting phenomenon took place in the nighttime sky just a few nights ago, and that was the first of 4 lunar eclipses that are going to take place in successions of 6 months. So this is a tetrad of lunar eclipses.
I remember you mentioning it on the previous show about
the last episode we talked about this a little bit.
And it will be quite a while after this before that occurs.
Yeah, it'll be a very long time before a 4 eclipse year or a set of eclipses within a year and a half take place. Now here's the interesting thing. We had planned to set our telescopes up, take images, live video of this event, and feed it out to the world. We put an advertisement on the website of our good friends at spaceweather.com. They have a very highly visited site, and so we had lots of folks visiting our website, and we had our web stream set up. But this is what took place: rain.
Oh yes.
Rain, and lots of it. We had a very major set of thunderstorms roll through the southeastern United States on Monday night and into Tuesday morning of April 15th, tax day 2014.
Bad timing.
And it kind of swamped us out. But
Yes.
but my staff, and that's why I want to tell the story because it's an interesting story, they did something that was very exciting.
Okay.
They went online and they were taking emails. By the way, that's an all-sky camera. You can see all those clouds over the head of the observatory at our location. And certainly that was not going to be a good night to observe anything except rain. Okay. But our folks, Dr. Rosa Williams and the team, were at the Space Science Center. They were taking email questions. They were answering them on air through a microphone system where we could actually speak directly with our audience who was watching the webcast. We happened to funnel in a video stream from the University of North Dakota. They were having clear skies, so we were able to provide some live images of the eclipse taking place.
Okay.
And that was through a connection with Dr. Andy Puckett, who is one of our astronomers here at Columbus State University. He had some friends up there at University of North Dakota. A shout out to them. Thank you very much for providing your web stream. But our folks who were running the program, Michael Johnson and some of the other guys who were there, they had an interesting idea. They said this. Over the microphone, they said, hey, if you're out there and you're listening to our webcast, if you got a good picture of the eclipse, why don't you send it in to us? They thought maybe they'd get 1 or 2 pictures, from people who maybe were actually photographing the event. Well, something very fun happened. Literally hundreds of people from all over the United States of America, from places like UK and Canada, they began to send their images into our observatory by the dozens. And these images ranged from everything from kind of blurry cell phone pictures all the way up to some very professional looking imaging taking place right here. We've assembled those into a video, and the video you're seeing here on the screen right now is just kind of it's a camera roll, if you will, a slideshow of all these pictures that were sent in. And it's just kind of a fun thing, because here's what happened. When people started seeing their own pictures appearing on our webcast, everybody got excited, right? And so, and when people started seeing other people's pictures, well, they wanted to send pictures in too. And all of a sudden, you had people from all over North America, from the UK, from Canada, sending images into our observatory, commenting on each other's images.
Bellevue, Washington.
There's Bellevue,
up there
Washington. That's a
with the,
beautiful picture right there.
Great, huh? Very
And
artistic.
here again, it didn't take any specific equipment. People were just using their cell phone, but people were sharing in this event. And I really think that's the power of this whole new media movement that we're seeing,
so too, yeah.
where people are communicating online, real time. That's the essence of our real-time observatory, where we're doing these webcasts, is so that we can make these kinds of things happen. We have the equipment on board at our observatory to be able to speak to our audiences over our webcasts and get them to interact with us. And that resulted in this very cool event. Now, let me just say, as you're watching these beautiful images come in, that a total of 48,000 unique viewers logged into our webcast that night. Remember, it's raining here.
Yes.
Right? So we had 48,000 viewers from 159 different countries, from over 8,600 different cities around the world,
Goodness.
logging in and watching the webcast. We did a little bit of web statistics to find out those numbers. One of the other web stats that we noticed was they were staying. And the reason they were staying is because they were seeing this very cool phenomenon of all these people sending in their photographs, and we're showing you now. The average stay time on our webcast was an hour. So
Oh,
they
that's
were
pretty good.
they were hanging around
Yeah.
and really watching the webcast. They were
People's
sending in their
attention
questions.
span, yes, that's
They were listening to the answers. That's a very beautiful photograph,
that's
by the way.
nice.
That came from a gentleman in the UK. Lovely photograph of a setting moon. You could actually see the atmospheric distortions. Here's another great shot of the eclipse from Houston, Texas, Memphis, Tennessee. Again, people all over America and some outlying regions sending stuff in. Really cool phenomenon. Again, the power behind this, people got to interact. Not just with us, but with all of the other people watching this webcast, which is a very large audience, for an event like this. And so we were very excited to be a part of this.
Great, yeah.
And we wish we could have provided our own images of a webcast, or of this eclipse rather, but we just couldn't do it because of the rain. But we were able to facilitate all kinds of people getting together and using our site as a hub to do so, and it was very, very fun.
I like it a lot. And this new media, this interactive media part of what everybody's moving to right now, you guys actually demonstrated that, and it was a wonderful reaction from others. They started sharing together. They stayed on the website watching this and looking at others as well. I think that was a wonderful experience.
It really is a neat experience, and one of the cool things about it is it makes you feel in touch with all the other people who really think the same kind of stuff is cool.
Yes.
Right? So it's all the people out there who really like astronomy and just love nature, basically, and wanted to somehow take part in it, interact. And this setup allowed them to do it. We didn't anticipate necessarily doing this part of the program, but it kind of organically evolved, and it was a really fun thing to be a part of. So one last thing I'd like to show you as you're watching some of these images come in. Some of those better images where you can see some of the color, I want you to look for kind of a turquoise shading to the moon. And lunar eclipses are red because as the light shines onto the Earth, some of that light gets through Earth's atmosphere and hits the moon, and that's why the moon turns kind of red in color. Earth's atmosphere is very good at scattering off the blue light, so only the red gets through. But on some of those images of the moon, you might see kind of a bluish or almost turquoise stripe. And that's because in the upper layers of the atmosphere, particularly in the upper stratosphere, there's this substance called ozone. And ozone actually does a good job of absorbing red light and allowing blue light to get through. So where we had mostly an orange moon because of the natural Rayleigh scattering taking place in Earth's atmosphere, we also had this effect from the stratosphere of kind of a blue hazing around that. And you can actually see that on some of the images that were sent into us from these astrophotographers around America. So that was kind of a cool thing too. Well, another thing that tells scientists is that the stratosphere right now happens to be very clear. In other words, it's free of volcanic dust. There you can see on this picture right here, that very bluish ring just to the edge of the white right there. Very clear indication of that very clear stratosphere. If a volcano happens somewhere in the world, or if debris, here again you can see that turquoise color. If debris is thrown into that upper stratosphere, you won't see that, because what'll happen is that stratosphere gets filled with this dusty material, which is very good at absorbing out those short wavelengths of light, and it gets kind of red again. In fact, the moon can get very almost blood red, dusky red. But in this case, a very clear stratosphere led to a very kind of blue hint to some of those lunar photographs.
Very interesting. I'm glad you explained that part to it. They had the very orange, dark orange, and then with this blue.
Hint of blue in this photograph here again, right? You can see it there. So again, thank you to all the people out there who took part in this webcast. And listen, you really made it, right? So our folks here facilitated, but all of you out there who sent in photographs, you're the ones who really made this webcast unique. You made it a special media event on our computer media. You made a great webcast for each other. And I think that may be the most interesting thing about it to me, is just that phenomenon that kind of organically grew out of this event.
I like it, and those pictures continue there. All right, so that was a great experience.
It was
fun. All the clouds and the rain, it was torrential rains down here at that point.
You know, astronomy in the southeast, it's maybe not the best observing location, but that's where we are, so we do the best we can.
There we go. And you made, took those lemons and made some lemonade on that.
We
I
tried.
think it was great. Well, congratulations to
Thank
your
you.
group down there for pulling that off as
Appreciate
well.
that.
And using the latest technology to make things happen. All right, you have a couple announcements too.
Yeah, I just want to give here to close out the show, I want to give a couple of shout outs to a couple of our students here at Columbus State University who are students in our Earth and Space Sciences department. They are astrophysics and planetary geology majors, and the two of them have been doing a phenomenal job in a variety of circumstances. One of these two gentlemen, Cameron McCarty, was in on this lunar eclipse webcast, so he was staying up all night helping to facilitate that imaging and the sharing of those images. But there's a couple of gentlemen I really want to give a shout out to because they've had some very major accomplishments, and I want to talk about those.
Sure.
The first one of those is a student by the name of John Hood. John Hood is a graduating senior. In fact,
Thanks, John.
next month he'll be graduating. He's on the right-hand side right here. He's standing next to astronaut Dr. Bernard Harris, who happened to be visiting Space Science Center there
Remember that
a
visit
year
well.
ago.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
great.
So that was last year. They're standing in front of the Space Shuttle main engine nozzle in our exhibit gallery right there. But John Hood was just named the Columbus State University Student Employee of the Year.
Yes.
Now there are literally over 100 student employees on campus. Over 27 of them were nominated for this award, but because of John's massive contributions to our observatory and all the great work that he's done here at Columbus State University, he was the one picked, not by us, not by those of us who are prejudiced, but by the good folks at Human Resources, based on his resume, to be the Student Assistant of the Year, and we are just extremely proud of John.
All right, congratulations, John.
John has
There you
a
go.
great
Good
future
job.
ahead of him. He's actually flying off next month down to Australia. He's being interviewed for a PhD program in radio astronomy down in Australia, and we wish him all the best of luck on that. So that
All
was
right, same
that was
here.
one of
Way
the
to go,
that was one of
John.
the acknowledgments we want to give out. The second one is for Cameron McCarty, who I just mentioned a moment ago.
yeah.
I think we have an image of Cameron here. This was another webcast. This was Cameron in Australia preparing for a lunar eclipse, a solar eclipse webcast rather, that took place last year. He's actually at an Aboriginal school there. He's showing kids the sun through a hydrogen alpha telescope, a safe telescope to look at the sun. These kids had never even seen a telescope before.
Okay.
And here is Cameron out in the middle of the bush in Australia, sharing that technology with those kids for the very first time. A really cool experience.
No telling what that kid's looking through the telescope's going to do with that experience and how it might change his life, you know?
We would love to
Great
think that
things.
we're inspiring the next generation of astronomers and engineers in Australia as well, right? So that's a really cool thing. Cameron McCarty was just selected for a summer internship at the Marshall Space Flight Center. This will be his second internship. This summer, Cameron's going to be actually analyzing samples from the lunar surface in the Lunar Planetary Lab at Marshall Space Flight Center. So that's fantastic work. Cameron was also selected to represent all of the intern program for all of the NASA centers. He was selected as just a handful of students to go to Washington, D.C. on behalf of that program and represent that program to the legislators in Washington, D.C. So Cameron, fantastic work, buddy. You've done a lot of amazing stuff here at Columbus State University, and I am tipping my hat to you guys right now. Cameron and John, two of our very greatest students, but we have a lot of other great students in that program, and you'll be hearing more about their accomplishments in coming shows because we just couldn't be prouder of this crop of students who are moving through the Earth and Space Sciences, Astrophysics, and Planetary Geology program.
Oh, that is amazing, and hats off to those guys for doing such a wonderful job. And they're getting a great experience here at Columbus State University in your department. And the Coca-Cola Space Science Center is always doing something wonderful and amazing and helping us learn more about space science.
We acknowledge the support of all the folks from the university and also the faculty members involved in Earth and Space Science, all of the geology, environmental science, all of the faculty in that department, physics faculty. Everybody's contributing to these wonderful programs, and Space Science Center is just playing a role in that, and I'm tipping my hat to all y'all out there. So.
All right, sounds good. And that STEM initiative, too, I think you have something to do with that. We want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching This Week in Space Science. It's been another twist. Dr. Sean Cruzen, Executive Director of the Coca-Cola Space Science Center here at Columbus State University.
Thanks,
and
Mike.
Thank you, Sean. And we're glad that you're tuning in. Watch us each week right here on Columbus State Television, CSU.TV, on the web. We'll see you next time.
From the studios of Columbus Media Group, you're watching Columbus Television.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Got Therapy. I'm Michael Baltimore. I'm here with Dr. Dan Rose. Dr. Rose, how are you today?
So I was trying to have a little beverage. Need
Yes,
some beverage.
a little. That's a good thing. All right, so
I drink nothing but distilled water, by the way. It's what fuels this beast.
very interesting. Only distilled
God gives you a
water.
Ferrari. You want to put the right kind of gasoline in. That's all I got to say.
That almost brings us to our topic today
Yes.
because we are going to talk about narcissism. I think
Narcissism.
that's our topic. So,
Yes.
Very interesting. You're in a time. This is Got Therapy 2016, so that means we're in election time, and so there's a lot
Lots
of
of
politics
narcissism
going
on display.
lots of narcissism on display. So we want to talk a little bit more about it. Now, we are both licensed mental health professionals, if you will. And we want
And when I say that somewhere like Freud or the whole governing body of the APA sort of shudder, but it's true.
That's right.
I am.
That's right. A lot of people wonder. But
a true
nevertheless, here we are, years of experience. We dealt with the narcissistic personality disorder in our practices. And so today...
And
we
home
will-
life.
And home life for some of us, right? So what we'll do today is sort of break it down a little bit and talk about it. There's an article in one of the newspapers in Washington that talked about a politician who made the case for a psychiatric evaluation of Donald Trump, who's running for president at this point in time. We're 90 days or 100 days away from the election. So she made the case using the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 from the American Psychiatric Association, and listed the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder, and then matched that up with some of the things that Mr. Trump had said during his political campaign. So there's a lot of controversy about this, and you know, politics is something that we try not to talk about, but I think this has pushed us into looking at where we're a little more comfortable in talking, and that's mental health and psychology and issues of that kind. So today we're going to talk about the narcissistic personality disorder. I may just say that there is somewhat of a disclaimer that we're not making a diagnosis at a distance. I don't think we want to cross that line, but we certainly just want to discuss the issues in general and talk about some of the claims that have been made, particularly about what's come up in the very recent news and with this article that was published saying that a congresswoman has said he needs a psychiatric eval.
Yeah, and the Washington Post about one Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this. First of all, what there are personality disorders, and that's a
telling me.
classification in the
My whole dating history. I can tell you, you go back, my love life is a tour through the DSM.
Okay,
It's,
yeah, there's a lot in there, but basically it's a classification system of mental disorders, and it's used throughout mental health, psychology, and so forth, to help understand the presenting symptoms by a client, a patient coming in for treatment, and then therefore leading us to a course of treatment, and that's a very dense, quick sort of definition of it. Can you talk a little bit about this? First of all, talk about the personality disorders in general, because there are a number of those, the borderline and histrionic and so forth. Let's start there, and then we'll kind of filter down to the narcissistic personality disorder. So one of the things we know about personality disorders is that they are long-term in nature. I've heard that said quite a bit. So what do you think?
There's some indication that as one gets older, that some of the symptoms of personality disorders, particularly those of antisocial, even narcissism, diminish. There seems to be something there. It's also important to remember that these are very blurry categories, and there's a lot of controversy over how to define them. I went to a big conference a few years back where they had every expert in, so they took like whoever, the expert in narcissistic personality disorder, the expert in borderline personality disorder. Kernberg was there, and all these guys, and all of them universally said that we really don't know what we're trying to define. And there's lots of blur in all this. So it's really, one way maybe to think about this, and I sort of distill it down into something really, really, really simple. And it's how we deal with our emotions in relations to others. And that you could sort of take all those personality disorders and they sort of help define a specific way that people deal with the feelings they have in relationship to others. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So then you have like borderline personality disorder, you have antisocial personality disorder, you have obsessive compulsive personality disorder, you have narcissistic personality disorder.
And one that's popular these days, the bipolar.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because lots of things that we have today were listed squarely within that personality disorder syndrome, and they sort of wandered into other categories and areas. And that's what makes it, and there's lots and lots of bleed over. But
right, so there's no straightforward demarcation between these personality disorders. Some of those symptoms may cross over, and so a person may have some from the different categories that are crossing over. It's very interesting that we don't have a very precise, but that's human nature. That's the nature of what we're doing with mental health, I guess. But in our culture, in our society, we have our own definitions of that. But for the most part,
any woman who wouldn't go out with me, I just automatically assume there's
you assume that
they have a disorder.
Oh, they have a disorder. I was thinking you were confirming.
No.
That
It's obvious that this individual who didn't want to have time to spend time with me was
all right.
somehow
I think
sick.
you're beginning to open up what we need to look at, and those are what are these symptoms that people display in their narcissistic personality disorder. So what is this narcissistic?
Well, first what I would do is I would anytime you want to think about any diagnostic category, you want to first normalize it, and that they're and one of the I did a lot of training with folks who had trained under Heinz Kohut, and Kohut was a guy who invented this thing called self-psychology. It still exists, but it was certainly big in the 70s and 80s. Sure. And narcissism was the cornerstone of his theory, and that narcissism is a form of a disorder of the self. And it sort of goes like this, that we all have a self that we have to maintain. We have to maintain some sort of inner equilibrium about how we feel about ourselves and others in the world. And that there are always things that throw us off that equilibrium, things that sort of happen. And when they do, we can engage in lots of activities, potential, and one of those would be the self-aggrandizement, that inflation of the self, the pufferfish sort of thing. So in the face of feeling anything, feeling anxiety, slight discomfort, we can suddenly pufferfish it, and we can suddenly make ourselves the biggest thing in the room. Kohut would say that that's defensive. He would also say that it's on a continuum. All of us have to maintain a narcissistic equilibrium. We all have to.
Okay.
And that, but there are healthier and less healthier ways to do so. And I think what her article is saying is she thinks, and this is her opinion, that Trump is someone who has displayed over and over again an unhealthy way to maintain that equilibrium. Right. And the result, he may not be someone you want with the most powerful job in the world.
So someone who is out of equilibrium, much more so balanced toward the self than others. In other words, everything has to be centered around. It's almost a self-centeredness. Everything that is out in the world, even other people, has to do with themselves.
Well, part of at the healthiest continuum, we may have a moment we slip when when we get in that disequilibrium where we can see the world, we can only see ourselves and the rest of the world around us, the people around us, as part objects. But we can quickly, or relatively quickly, move back to a place of balance where we can see ourselves and other people as other selves, as whole objects. So, we might be able to apologize. And it's very difficult to say whether this is actually political theater or not, but one of the things the Democrats did a really good job of was sort of making use of the Muslim American father who'd lost his son in Iraq.
Very controversial issue, and controversial because of Trump's response to that.
And again, it's hard to say how much of this is political theater and how much is being played up and distorted, but Trump's response, which again, if he was under attack, the guy was waving the Constitution and said, "You've lost nothing." So we can see at that moment, Trump sustained a narcissistic injury that anybody would experience. I think that's a universal occurrence. If you were attacked in that way, what we want to think about is how he responded. And I think what the Congresswoman says, that Trump's response shows an inability to see the other, that he continued to maintain the role to see the father and his wife as part objects. If he had said something akin to, your son gave the ultimate sacrifice for his country. I hope that you can be proud of him, and I certainly am. And I disagree with the things that he said, and I really think that maybe he and I should sit down and talk. And if we did, I think he might see that I am much closer to the way to what he believes, or whatever. He could say something like that.
Right, sure.
But if you'll notice, that sort of response requires the capacity to be able to see the other. Right. And you could say, and I think that's part of what she's trying to say here, is that his response was one of, he continued to be focused on his own injuries and not so much on the person in front of him. Right.
You talked about a wound that that his ego, his sort of definition of himself was accosted. It was he saw it as some attack on himself, when which really kind of leads to the cutoff from others. And I would say empathy, the idea of sort of understanding what's going on with another person and how it affects, and have that moment of empathy as opposed to feeling attacked and then having to attack back.
And Kohut's contribution to our field is that he raised empathy to the nth degree. That empathy is the thing that cures, and empathy is the thing that a narcissist needs. So that in Kohut's treatment of narcissist, he would, again, whether it's Trump or whoever we might deem this as narcissist. Not we're saying Trump's a narcissist. But keep making that disclaimer. APA hasn't called him narcissist.
That's it, right?
But that if someone who is a narcissist comes into treatment, and I'm sort of combing through some of the things that have occurred with patients over the last few weeks, and I have a couple of patients who pretty squarely move in this narcissistic realm. And I think of a patient who he has a roommate, and his roommate didn't clean up the dishes. Right. And so he came in and he spent the first 15 or 20 minutes talking about how the roommate was horrible, the roommate was a loser, the roommate was overweight, the roommate was all these sorts of things. And it was this what Kohut calls narcissistic rage.
Okay.
So he experienced the lack of dishes, and anybody in that situation would be annoyed, maybe even really upset. But what made this narcissistic is it spurred narcissistic rage, And then there was this poisonous attack in which the roommate became a part object. There was splitting. The roommate became this horrible person. If this person was organized a little differently, they may have experienced that frustration as anger but they still might hold and maintain some image of the other where they weren't this complete and utter, and they weren't, it didn't become rage. Right. And what I think she says, and there's even some couple of articles that we have here too, where, she would say that Trump has a tendency to respond to every attack, be it from a Twitter feed, from wherever the case may be, with a certain level of rage, calling his opponents dumb and crooked and lying and all that sort of stuff, and that might reflect this narcissistic rage that comes from any slight wounding.
Right, any small, that most of us would probably take that hit, but it wouldn't
cause us to go whoop,
right,
and then suddenly have to reassert ourselves in some ways that are clearly narcissistic in nature.
Well, it's interesting in a political climate too, because now we're at the national election cycle past the primaries, and the notion is that this is on a much bigger stage. There's also something about seeking attention that is in this narcissistic symptom list, if you will. But also at the same time, you have to be seeking attention. You want people's attention. So the system that they're in is almost as if it's encouraging the narcissist.
There was an article, and I can't remember where, this was years ago, where they were talking about, and they were using examples of the continuum of narcissism. And they were using Bill Clinton as an example of a more healthy form of narcissism.
Okay.
But what you said is, to want to get up in front of people, or to have the eyes of, or lots of people to be thinking of you, that is a form of narcissism. That is, But again, we have to put that in a continuum, and we have to be able to say that there is Freud called it primary narcissism, and Freud's vision is that, and he had that libido theory. So there was this notion that we had all this energy that we're directing toward ourselves, and we have to find a way to be able to turn it out into the world. And he said that's part of what our growth and the right sort of developmental things occur that move us in that direction. Right. Coates is a bit more in the sense that we are other-driven, and we want the investment of others. And so there is a healthy amount of narcissism that would push anybody into public office. You have to tolerate, or at least crave and pursue, that sort of investment and interest. And that someone like Clinton maybe, again, the article was talking about he might be a different form of narcissism. Again, I didn't say that, it was the article, wasn't me. Right. And that you could almost, in a way, compare and contrast maybe Trump and Clinton in terms of how they might handle this investment and this need for connection, and that might be interesting.
Well, it's really interesting that so many people have kind of jumped on the Donald Trump bandwagon, or strong supporters, and even when some of this very controversial kind of presentation is made, that they don't doubt that. It's almost like it reinforces something with them. In other words, he said at one point, I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I would not lose any voters.
Yeah.
I mean, who makes that statement?
Yeah,
but it's very interesting. We could probably we could do a whole show on the list of things, just the list that he said.
We'll look at any charismatic leader, and history shows that there are a number of people who appear to be malignant narcissists who come into power. They become leaders of cults. They become leaders of nations. I mean, there is something both alluring. There is something, the narcissist, and again, there are different types of narcissism, but there are the type of narcissist who has the capacity to draw you in. You can feel a warm glow in their presence. They stoke the fires in you as their own fires get stoked. And again and again through history, that has proven bad things have happened.
Yes, and well, the issue that a supporter is sort of reinforced for some of their own narcissism, if you will, in that way. But I heard someone say that these are people who, regardless of what happens or what is said, will still be in that camp. In other words, they just sort of hunker down and stay in that, even more so, even strongly a more strong support for the person in this, and that's a little strange. It's
Yeah, there's
a
some
little hard to
interesting
explain
research on that. I was reading some of that this morning. And it's called. There's a term for it. And there's some interesting research on that. That having a piece of knowledge can cause you to be ignorant of other forms of knowledge, and that knowing there's some interesting research, which, and again, not to be too political, but on the difference between conservative and liberal personalities and even brain functioning. And one of the things that pop up again and again, and there's also a notion of fascism and this measure of fascism, and how in some ways Trump's rhetoric speaks from a fascist perspective. You know, that there's a way in which that is us and them.
Right.
There's a way in which
Very
that it, you know,
splitting
that,
in that way.
in fact, you can go back and you can look at some of whether it's and again, shouldn't. How long do you go into a conversation before you drop the Hitler bomb? But we're farther enough in this. I think I can do this.
Well, it's often in politics you see that.
Yeah, there's
coming out. They throw
but,
that out very
you know,
easily.
Hitler ran on the platform of making Germany great again. That's what the idea of a Third Reich was.
Wow. Okay, there you go.
That really was.
That's not a ball cap I want, by the way.
Was, you know, very much about this creating a utopia that we will make this place that we will return to, and so there are these. So all that sort of runs through this sort of fascist rhetoric. But what seems to be interesting is if you look at some of the research on politics and through this liberal and conservative divide, there are two or three things that stand out. One of those is disgust responses. They hooked individuals up to functional MRIs and showed them pictures of a muffin with maggots on it, and based on the response that they saw in the functional MRI, they were up to, it was like an 83% chance of determining what their politics were.
Wow.
They could literally say that they could make that call with that level of certainty. And the other was this notion of openness to experience. So there's disgust and these, there are a couple of others too, but I think that was the most interesting. And if you'll notice in Trump's rhetoric, there are Mexicans, there are rapists pouring across the border.
Right.
That's a narrative that he pulls from. Mm-hmm. And he makes this broad Muslims. Maybe we need to stop Muslims from coming into this country. He talks about, at one point, attacking the families of ISIS people, of bringing back waterboarding or worse.
Right.
And both of these reflect a...
And I might add, some of the recent ones had to do with why can't we use nuclear weapons? Mm-hmm. So
Which
even
is,
pull out the weapons.
Yeah, that's
very interesting point.
Yeah, that's
I didn't mean to take you off on there, but
having grown up in a time when the nuclear threat loomed large, that really doesn't.
Right.
That's not a.
But also, go ahead.
But these are all fear responses. These are all they're the very active amygdala that they activate that part of the brain, and there's something about when you say that his base. There's nothing he could do that they wouldn't vote against him, and it may have something to do with this fear, this being grounded in needing to act quickly and decisively, and maybe even violently in the face of what looks like an overwhelming and consuming threat.
Right. I mean, the notion of playing to the fear is a big strategy. It's a huge strategy now in politics across the board. Probably more for one party than the other, but nevertheless, it's there, and it plays to that very deep sort of. And at the same time, they're talking about change, and I think we can all kind of go along with the idea of change. But when you add that to this fear that's being promoted, and you should be fearful, kind of thing.
But even you talk about change, and there's certainly there's a difference between improvement and we're screwed, we better do something desperate.
Right.
There's a big difference. Exactly. And I think that part of what's played up, and how this may link to the narcissism, there is that warm glow of certainty that the narcissist gives off, and you'll notice. And again, this may simply be political theater, and I'm not saying that I've followed Trump's platform with a fine-tooth comb. But you often make very vague promises, like we're going to. You'll say things like, "Crime is the worst it's ever been in the history of the United States, and we're going to fix that." Well, the problem with that, and that's sort of paraphrasing of things that were said, crime actually isn't. Crime may be up in a few major cities,
gone down overall,
but actually overall it's incredibly low. Police violence also, even though it may seem like that's not the case, there are all these things that the fact that somehow there are all these rapists flooding from Mexico. There's absolutely nothing to support that.
Nothing. But you play into the fear when you say those make those provocative statements, and so that kind of keeps things going. And you're touching on something within the individual supporter and the group that resonates with them and kind of triggers that almost primal kind of response in that. Well, here's a gentleman who is 70 years of age, I understand, and so that begins. I begin to think about this.
Does that account for the orange color? Does that
I
at a certain
don't know
age,
if you get more orange.
Do you become
as you
more orange, or is that a?
But it leads me to this question about whether or not a person can change the personality disorder issue if that were the case.
Well, my wife's been hoping for this. 20-something years.
I know your wife, and I'm sure she does, as a matter of fact.
She's really
wondering about
she's banking on something.
when is this going to turn the corner. So that's my question.
A hopeful woman, by the way.
Very well, yeah. Yes, and has endured for a long time.
That's right.
So is there a possibility for the narcissistic personality disorder person to change? Is there some, and I've even heard on talk shows, an intervention was being talked about at some point. But I mean, and others that said, we see the true core of this person now. This is what we have, and it's not going to change. So,
well, I wouldn't
is
expect,
there a possibility?
While someone is in the White House, many things, forms of intervention or the possibility of change. But actually, it's funny because most narcissists come to treatment because they've been forced by family members. It's seldom a self-motivated
that
occurrence.
makes sense, right? I mean, if I'm narcissistic and it's all about myself and I'm the most important person in the room and I've got all the ideas, and I think Donald Trump said he talks to a lot of people, but his primary consultant is himself. So why would a person go into therapy?
Like what's that Woody Allen quote? Maybe I won't go there.
All right, that's all right. All right, we'll cut. But yeah, so that's the notion. So this person wouldn't normally, on their own, go into treatment or look for some change process. So even given that, is it even possible for change?
Well, there's two things that might bring a narcissist in. Three things really: the desire to fix the people around them, being forced into treatment because of the people around them, or their symptoms have become significantly ego dystonic. They are in such a place of suffering that they have no other choice. So there are three things. There may be others, but those can be three categories we can anticipate. If you look at some of and there's some interesting research on this. In fact, you know, they were trying to get rid of narcissistic personality disorder in the DSM-5.
That's right. We were talking about. You said there was hope for you.
If they got rid of it, I'd be cured.
You would be cured. You'd be fine.
But
however, it's still there.
But it's still there.
Shoot.
And part of that had to do with that they thought that they could sort of distribute narcissistic personality disorder into other categories and whatnot. But if you look at the outcome research on this, and some of it is anecdotal, particularly the stuff that I know, but what Koa talked about is, you know, this is a disorder of insight and compassion for both self and other. And so those are the things you want to be able to generate in the person that you're with. You want to make them be able to slow them down enough. Like if we give my example of a guy getting angry at his roommate, if we can get him connected to what he feels, for him to say, you know, I feel that when my roommate doesn't clean the dishes, that he is making me feel less than. He's making me feel small. And if you slow it down enough, the individual has a chance to be able to name that experience and to own it in such a way they can do something different with it. It doesn't become this knee-jerk, reflexive, narcissistic response. They can slow it down enough. And you know, some of the research that I know about this involves this concept of mentalization. If you can get them to say, well, the roommate didn't clean up the dishes because the roommate isn't clean in many areas of their life. This is a problem the roommate has, and maybe it's because they didn't have the parents to help them to be able to develop these skills, whatever the case may be. But the roommate begins to humanize the other. It begins to see their roommate as someone who did this not motivated by as a direct attack, but motivated by their own failings, generates a compassion in the other, the capacity to mentalize them, to be aware of their own response, and then they can do something with it that isn't reflexive. That's a lot.
Right, that is a lot. So I don't know if I garnered a lot of hope about this change occurring.
Well, if we can call, and not that we're calling Trump a narcissist, but this congresswoman does. It's interesting because what I may say would be in Trump's favor is folks who are pathologically narcissistic often don't. This is a man who's been able to sustain some level of success and has been able to maintain relationships with others in such a way that would suggest wherever he lands on the narcissistic spectrum, he at least has some compensatory and he has some strengths he can pull from. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to say how much of with Trump isn't either maybe a role that he plays, this may how much of this is maybe carefully constructed.
Well, you talked about this being sort of almost a theatrical presentation in some ways, and there have certainly been some questions about that. It does seem extraordinary. I mean, I think you once in one of our earlier episodes talked about, and we mentioned the politics, and you said it's never been like this in your lifetime.
Yeah, this is a new thing. I was on the way over here. I was listening to NPR, and there was a historian saying that, well, actually, they were sort of talking about that there have been some precedent for this. However, I think what sows the seeds for this is we live in a level of connection through the internet and through all these different sources,
certainly
Facebook,
Twitter, by the way, yes.
Our current level of interconnectivity, I think, generates the possibility for someone to if you look at the popular TV show that ended not long ago, The Colbert Report.
Right.
He sort of generated this sort of caricature. I think we live in a day and an age with all this interconnectivity that it's possible for the cult of personality to be resurrected in such a way that we could see things like this. I mean, it's right. It's I think that there's a level that there is.
The stage is set for this kind of presentation in a way. When really, I think what's important to a lot of us is some genuineness, some authenticity. A person that's real, that deals with the difficult things in their lives and sort of gives a measured response as opposed to some reactive 140 character response.
This, what I'm about to say is probably hard to be controversial, but if there are those of us who are as neurologically different, that they respond to fear, if they respond, their openness to experience are different, then there may be something intractable about this, right. But it also may be because, as you might gather, I tend more toward the left spectrum of things.
Okay.
I mean, that's my so it's very easy to be able to, to come at this from an elitist perspective or whatnot. But
right. Well, just what you just did there was sort of recognize the bias or recognize something in you that might sort of slant the outcome.
And
I don't hear that in
that was an act of mentalization. I just was thinking, I had the capacity for self-reflection to slow myself down enough to be able to say, okay, and that that's a non-splitting space. That is a capacity to see, nuance and variation, and that's difficult to maintain when you are feeling lots of things.
Right.
There's a whole saying that when you are madly in love, that's a lousy time to mentalize. Your love object is the greatest thing on the planet.
Right.
Right. If you are if you're experiencing intense emotional experiences, moving to shades of black and white are really important. However, when it comes to nuanced decision, when making plans for a future, involve the capacity to be able to think about complexities.
Yes, our world is so complex, and all of those situations that seem to be sort of in the press with these sound bites don't really represent
the true complexity of making a good decision that affects so many people. Well, on another talk show that I was listening to said that if we're doing an intervention, that it has to be about his success, Mr. Trump's business. If he's losing money, if he is...
Unfortunately, he's not.
He's not.
He's literally turned. If what I'm saying, he's one of the first presidential king in history that may actually turn a profit. Or he was during the primaries. Maybe I'm wrong, but so yeah.
Well, there's a lot of even in today's news, there's a notion of the small contributions and how many of those that he's also caught up a great deal in terms of funding simply from the $10, $20 donation from so many people. Yes, but in order to change, and I think we're still kind of on that topic of, is there something that will help him sort of balance? He's gotten a lot of advice, Mr. Trump, from a lot of consultants, but he's not paid attention to any of it. He's always been sort of
if he were
path.
someone with a narcissistic disturbance, part of what happens in that moment of wounding, and narcissists are very vulnerable to wounding, they're going to act reflexively.
Okay.
So all the, when you're sitting in a room full of a bunch of people with advisors, you're much less likely to receive the wound that you would if you were being interviewed or if you were up on the stage and there's all sorts of things happening. It's difficult to see someone with a narcissistic disturbance not acting reflexively, just like that.
Right. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote the book about Lincoln, and one of the premises of the book is that you surround yourself with a lot of different people, even those who disagree with you, so that you get that information in to make a good decision.
I'm not sure his decision to surround himself with supermodels. I mean, I'm
I
not
think
sure
that's
if that
more
generates.
like what we have. He said,
yeah.
I think the only difference between me and the other candidates is that I'm more honest and my women are more beautiful.
Right. That almost sounds like something Conan the Barbarian would say. That sounds like. Am I wrong? That sounds like
It certainly seems to be, but this is a very interesting time, and so I'm glad today we had a chance to talk about what's going on in the public arena, and certainly right now it's very important to a lot of people. We're all very interested in how this turns out. We want the best for the country, that kind of thing, and so still there's that divide. There's a split. It's almost like the mental health term that we talk about with borderline personality and bipolar and so forth, that they split people, and it seems like the country has had this mental kind of definition that we use applied to the country at large, and we're split for certain reasons. So,
and in fact, it would all be wonderfully interesting if it weren't possible that it might kill me.
Right.
It's one thing to be able to see things from afar and notice, but to be in the middle of it and, to be a little worried about... I actually see in my practice folks who are worried about... Politics often makes people anxious, but this seems to be generating a level of fear and anxiety.
I would think so. If we kind of look at what the clients that are coming into our practice and going to counseling every day, this is overlaid on what they're dealing with, their own personal issues and relationships, and all of a sudden politics is really having an impact, more so than we've seen in quite a while. So final thoughts on this narcissistic personality disorder. This is something that occurs, if you're diagnosed with this, it has occurred over a long period of time. There's evidence to say it's across situations. It's not just one sort of event, but it's multiple events. It's seen throughout. There's evidence for that thing. A focus on the individual and their personality, and the need to seek attention, the need to be some grandiose in some ways, almost a lack of empathy, I suppose we've talked about. Final thoughts on this narcissistic.
The way to think about this is the untreated narcissist can really only be managed, and I think that's often very important. That when I'm working with family members or individuals who have someone in their life who's could be malignantly narcissistic, or for them to be able to give a name to what the other person is and doing, and to find a way to manage the other and themselves when they're in the presence of the narcissist.
Right.
What that would do on a national level, I'm not sure.
Right.
I don't know.
It's hard. Be hard to manage. I think that's the word, but it does seem like that. I mean, we can manage our responses if we're in the close proximity of that. And,
I do have one thing though, and we talked about this last week. I find that in moments of despair, when I'm losing a bit of hope, when I'm feeling overwhelmed by events, say political events, I go to the ham cam. And you can simply gaze at the world's oldest ham in real time at any moment. I think it helps.
That kind of suits the
ham cam.
live cam.
I think the live ham cam. The world's oldest ham.
Been down that road, been there. I have not looked at it, by the way.
You should have. I have spent hours, me and the ham.
Well,
I feel a certain connection, and and
I'm thinking anything that works for you, I will be for, and hopefully this has been helpful to you today, but also to the folks viewing. And I want to thank you for tuning in to Got Therapy. Michael Baltimore, Dr. Dan Rose. We're here. Tune in next time. We'll see you then.
You're watching Columbus Television. Stay connected to Columbus by watching on your mobile device or laptop. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Watch productions from the Columbus area and our educational programming. Education and television together. It's the next generation of television programming. You're watching Columbus Television. You're watching Columbus Television. We are streaming on the internet. Download our apps for Android and Apple iPhone and iPad. It's on cols.tv.
Put up some resistance, and what can you do to sort of make sense of the craziness that's going on in the world and how it might affect the individual and the family? It's a big task, and we're all faced with it.
It's funny because one of my favorite, I've said it on the show many times, one of my favorite ways to define trauma is anything that arrives before you have a chance to create it. And it's the lack of preparation. It's like if you wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is turn on your computer and the news, and you hear like, I think today it was 80 people were killed by a guy driving a truck. You hear that sort of stuff. You literally, this is the definition of something that arrives that you haven't had a chance to create. And I think at ground zero, at the impact of that, you have a couple of choices. And I think some of those choices can make it worse and actually turn it into a trauma. And I think that what I might suggest, and this comes from my sort of theoretical model and my perspective, is you have to at least initially engage with the impact of this event. As each of these events happen, they have a chance also to compound themselves, so we ratchet ourselves up more and more. I think being able to do something with that initial impact, allowing yourself to acknowledge, I know I say it all the time, but Dan Siegel has a way of saying, the first step is to name it, to tame it. And to be able to say, this is a trauma. When things like this happen, they may not be happening to me, since I'm part of the world out there, since I'm connected in the ways that we are. They do affect us. We are hit too.
Watch productions from the Columbus area and our educational programming.
Training with folks who were trained under Heinz Kohut. Kohut was a guy who invented this thing called self-psychology. It still exists.
Stay connected to Columbus by watching on your mobile device or laptop. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
From the studios of Columbus Media Group, you're watching Columbus Television. You're watching Columbus Television. We are streaming on the internet. Download our apps for Android and Apple iPhone and iPad. It's on
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till I felt that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I felt my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as if the heavens were a bell, and being were an ear, and I and silence some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. Just then, a plank in reason broke, and I fell down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. We know depression through metaphors. Emily Dickinson was able to convey it in language, Goya in an image. Half the purpose of art is to describe such iconic states. As for me, I had always thought myself tough, one of the people who could survive if I'd been sent to a concentration camp. In 1991, I had a series of losses. My mother died, a relationship I'd been in ended, I moved back to the United States from some years abroad, and I got through all of those experiences intact. But in 1994, 3 years later, I found myself losing interest in almost everything. I didn't want to do any of the things I had previously wanted to do, and I didn't know why. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to seep away from me in that moment. Everything there was to do seemed like too much work. I would come home and I would see the red light flashing on my answering machine. And instead of being thrilled to hear from my friends, I would think, what a lot of people that is to have to call back. Or I would decide I should have lunch. And then I would think, but I'd have to get the food out and put it on a plate and cut it up and chew it and swallow it. And it felt to me like the Stations of the Cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in discussions of depression is that you know it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous while you're experiencing it. You know that most people manage to listen to their messages and eat lunch and organize themselves to take a shower and go out the front door, and that it's not a big deal. And yet, you are nonetheless in its grip, and you are unable to figure out any way around it. And so I began to feel myself doing less and thinking less and feeling less. It was a kind of nullity, and then the anxiety set in. If you told me that I have to be depressed for the next month, I would say as long as I know it'll be over in November, I can do it. But if you said to me, you have to have acute anxiety for the next month, I would rather slit my wrists than go through it. It was the feeling all the time, like that feeling you have if you're walking and you slip or trip and the ground is rushing up at you, but instead of lasting half a second the way that does, it lasted for 6 months. It's a sensation of being afraid all the time, but not even knowing what it is that you're afraid of. And it was at that point that I began to think that it was just too painful to be alive, and that the only reason not to kill oneself was so as not to hurt other people. And finally, one day, I woke up and I thought perhaps I'd had a stroke, because I lay in bed completely frozen, looking at the telephone, thinking something is wrong and I should call for help. And I couldn't reach out my arm and pick up the phone and dial. And finally, after 4 full hours of my lying and staring at it, the phone rang, and somehow I managed to pick it up. And it was my father. And I said, I'm in serious trouble. We need to do something. The next day, I started with the medications and the therapy. And I also started reckoning with this terrible question. If I'm not the tough person who could have made it through a concentration camp, then who am I? And if I have to take medication, is that medication making me more fully myself? Or is it making me someone else? And how do I feel about it if it's making me someone else? I had two advantages as I went into the fight. The first is that I knew that, objectively speaking, I had a nice life, and that if I could only get well, there was something at the other end that was worth living for. And the other was that I had access to good treatment. But I nonetheless emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and emerged and relapsed, and finally understood I would have to be on medication and in therapy forever. And I thought, but is it a chemical problem or a psychological problem? And does it need a chemical cure or a philosophical cure? And I couldn't figure out which it was. And then I understood that actually we aren't advanced enough in either area for it to explain things fully. The chemical cure and the psychological cure both have a role to play. And I also figured out that depression was something that was braided so deep into us that there was no separating it from our character and personality. I want to say that the treatments we have for depression are appalling. They're not very effective. They're extremely costly. They come with innumerable side effects. They're a disaster. But I am so grateful that I live now and not 50 years ago, when there would have been almost nothing to be done. I hope that 50 years hence, people will hear about my treatments and be appalled that anyone endured such primitive science. Depression is the flaw in love. If you were married to someone and thought, well, if my wife dies, I'll find another one, it wouldn't be love as we know it. There's no such thing as love without the anticipation of loss, and that specter of despair can be the engine of intimacy. There are three things people tend to confuse: depression, grief, and sadness. Grief is explicitly reactive. If you have a loss and you feel incredibly unhappy, and then 6 months later you're still deeply sad but you're functioning a little better, it's probably grief, and it will probably ultimately resolve itself in some measure. If you experience a catastrophic loss and you feel terrible, and 6 months later you can barely function at all, then it's probably a depression that was triggered by the catastrophic circumstances. The trajectory tells us a great deal. People think of depression as being just sadness. It's much, much too much sadness, much too much grief at far too slight a cause. As I set out to understand depression and to interview people who had experienced it, there were people who seemed on the surface to have what sounded like relatively mild depression, who were nonetheless utterly disabled by it. And there were other people who had what sounded, as they described it, like terribly severe depression, who nonetheless had good lives in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And I set out to find out what it is that causes some people to be more resilient than other people. What are the mechanisms that allow people to survive? And I went out and I interviewed person after person who was suffering with depression. One of the first people I interviewed described depression as a slower way of being dead. And that was a good thing for me to hear early on, because it reminded me that that slow way of being dead can lead to actual deadness, that this is a serious business. It's the leading disability worldwide, and people die of it every day. One of the people I talked to when I was trying to understand this was a beloved friend who I had known for many years and who had had a psychotic episode in her freshman year of college and then plummeted into a horrific depression. She had bipolar illness, or manic depression as it was then known. And then she did very well for many years on lithium, and then eventually she was taken off her lithium to see how she would do without it. And she had another psychosis, and then plunged into the worst depression that I had ever seen, in which she sat in her parents' apartment, more or less catatonic, essentially without moving, day after day after day. And when I interviewed her about that experience some years later, she's a poet and psychotherapist named Maggie Robbins, When I interviewed her, she said, I was singing, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" over and over to occupy my mind. I was singing to blot out the things my mind was saying, which were, you are nothing. You are nobody. You don't even deserve to live. And that was when I really started thinking about killing myself. You don't think in depression that you've put on a gray veil and are seeing the world through the haze of a bad mood. You think that the veil has been taken away, the veil of happiness, and that now you're seeing truly. It's easier to help schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside of them that needs to be exorcised, but it's difficult with depressives because we believe we are seeing the truth. But the truth lies. I became obsessed with that sentence, but the truth lies. And I discovered as I talked to depressive people that they have many delusional perceptions. People will say, no one loves me. And you say, I love you. Your wife loves you. Your mother loves you. You can answer that one pretty readily, at least for most people. But people who are depressed will also say, no matter what we do, we're all just going to die in the end. Or they'll say, there can be no true communion between two human beings. Each of us is trapped in his own body. To which you have to say, that's true, but I think we should focus right now on what to have for breakfast. A lot of the time, what they are expressing is not illness, but insight. And one comes to think what's really extraordinary is that most of us know about those existential questions, and they don't distract us very much. There was a study I particularly liked in which a group of depressed and a group of non-depressed people were asked to play a video game for an hour. And at the end of the hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. The depressive group was usually accurate to within about 10%. And the non-depressed people guessed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. A lot of people said when I chose to write about my depression that it must be very difficult to be out of that closet, to have people know. They said, do people talk to you differently? And I said, yes, people talk to me differently. They talk to me differently insofar as they start telling me about their experience or their sister's experience or their friend's experience. Things are different because now I know that depression is the family secret that everyone has. I went a few years ago to a conference, and on Friday of the 3-day conference, one of the participants took me aside and she said, I suffer from depression and I'm a little embarrassed about it, but I've been taking this medication and I just wanted to ask you what you think. And so I did my best to give her such advice as I could. And then she said, you know, my husband would never understand this. He's really the kind of guy to whom this wouldn't make any sense. So I just, you know, it's just between us. And I said, yes, that's fine. On Sunday at the same conference, her husband took me aside. And he said, my wife wouldn't think that I was really much of a guy if she knew this, but I've been dealing with this depression and I'm taking some medication and I wondered what you think. They were hiding the same medication in 2 different places in the same bedroom. And I said that I thought communication within the marriage might be triggering some of their problems. But I was also struck by the burdensome nature of such mutual secrecy. Depression is so exhausting. It takes up so much of your time and energy, and silence about it, it really does make the depression worse. And then I began thinking about all the ways people make themselves better. I'd started off as a medical conservative. I thought there were a few kinds of therapy that worked. It was clear what they were. There was medication, there were certain psychotherapies, there was possibly electroconvulsive treatment, and that everything else was nonsense. But then I discovered something. If you have brain cancer and you say that standing on your head for 20 minutes every morning makes you feel better, it may make you feel better, but you still have brain cancer and you'll still probably die from it. But if you say that you have depression and standing on your head for 20 minutes every day makes you feel better, then it's worked, because depression is an illness of how you feel. And if you feel better, then you're effectively not depressed anymore. So I became much more tolerant of the vast world of alternative treatments. And I get letters. I get hundreds of letters from people writing to tell me about what's worked for them. Someone was asking me backstage today about meditation. My favorite of the letters that I got was the one that came from a woman who wrote and said that she had tried therapy, she had tried medication, she had tried pretty much everything, and she had found a solution and hoped I would tell the world. And that was making little things from yarn. She sent me some of them, and I'm not wearing them right now. I suggested to her that she also should look up obsessive-compulsive disorder in the DSM. And yet, when I went to look at alternative treatments, I also gained perspective on other treatments. I went through a tribal exorcism in Senegal that involved a great deal of ram's blood and that I'm not going to detail right now. But a few years afterwards, I was in Rwanda working on a different project, and I happened to describe my experience to someone. And he said, well, you know, that's West Africa and we're in East Africa, and our rituals are in some ways very different, but we do have some rituals that have something in common with what you're describing. And I said, oh, and he said, yes. He said, but we've had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers, especially the ones who came right after the genocide. And I said, what kind of trouble did you have? And he said, well, he said they would do this bizarre thing. He said they didn't take people out in the sunshine where you begin to feel better. They didn't include drumming or music to get people's blood going. They didn't involve the whole community. They didn't externalize the depression as an invasive spirit. Instead, what they did was they took people, one at a time, into dingy little rooms and had them talk for an hour about bad things that had happened to them. He said, we had to ask them to leave the country. Now, at the other end of alternative treatments, let me tell you about Frank Russakoff. Frank Russakoff had the worst depression, perhaps, that I've ever seen in a man. He was constantly depressed. He was, when I met him, at a point at which every month he would have electroshock treatment. Then he would feel sort of disoriented for a week. Then he would feel okay for a week. Then he would have a week of going downhill. And then he would have another electroshock treatment. And he said to me when I met him, it's unbearable to go through my weeks this way. I can't go on this way, and I figured out how I'm going to end it if I don't get better. But, he said to me, I heard about a protocol at Mass General for a procedure called a cingulotomy, which is a brain surgery, and I think I'm going to give that a try. And I remember being amazed at that point to think that someone who clearly had so many bad experiences with so many different treatments still had buried in him somewhere enough optimism to reach out for one more. And he had the cingulotomy, and it was incredibly successful. He's now a friend of mine. He has a lovely wife and 2 beautiful children. He wrote me a letter the Christmas after the surgery, and he said, my father sent me 2 presents this year. First, a motorized CD rack from the Sharper Image that I didn't really need, but I knew he was giving it to me to celebrate the fact that I'm living on my own and have a job I seem to love. And the other present was a photo of my grandmother, who committed suicide. As I unwrapped it, I began to cry, and my mother came over and said, are you crying because of the relatives you never knew? And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying now as I write to you. It's not that I'm so sad, but I get overwhelmed. I think because I could have killed myself, but my parents kept me going, and so did the doctors, and I had the surgery. I'm alive and grateful. We live in the right time, even if it doesn't always feel like it. I was struck by the fact that depression is broadly perceived to be a modern Western middle-class thing, and I went to look at how it operated in a variety of other contexts. And one of the things I was most interested in was depression among the indigent. And so I went out to try to look at what was being done for poor people with depression. And what I discovered is that poor people are mostly not being treated for depression. Depression is the result of a genetic vulnerability, which is presumably evenly distributed in the population, and triggering circumstances, which are likely to be more severe for people who are impoverished. And yet, it turns out that if you have a really lovely life but feel miserable all the time, you think, why do I feel like this? I must have depression. And you set out to find treatment for it. But if you have a perfectly awful life and you feel miserable all the time, the way you feel is commensurate with your life. And it doesn't occur to you to think, maybe this is treatable. And so we have an epidemic in this country of depression among impoverished people that's not being picked up and that's not being treated and that's not being addressed. And it's a tragedy of a grand order. And so I found an academic who was doing a research project in slums outside of DC, where she picked up women who had come in for other health problems and diagnosed them with depression, and then provided 6 months of the experimental protocol. One of them, Lolly, came in, and this is what she said the day she came in. She said, and she was a woman, by the way, who had 7 children. She said, I used to have a job, but I had to give it up because I couldn't go out of the house. I have nothing to say to my children. In the morning, I can't wait for them to leave, and then I climb in bed and pull the covers over my head. And 3 o'clock when they come home, it just comes so fast. She said, I've been taking a lot of Tylenol, anything I can take so that I can sleep more. My husband has been telling me I'm stupid, I'm ugly. I wish I could stop the pain. Well, she was brought into this experimental protocol, and when I interviewed her 6 months later, she had taken a job working in childcare for the US Navy. She had left the abusive husband, and she said to me, my kids are so much happier now. She said, there's one room in my new place for the boys and one room for the girls, but at night they're just all up on my bed and we're doing homework all together and everything. One of them wants to be a preacher, one of them wants to be a firefighter, and one of the girls says she's going to be a lawyer. They don't cry like they used to, and they don't fight like they did. That's all I need now, is my kids. Things keep on changing. The way I dress, the way I feel, the way I act. I can go outside not being afraid anymore. And I don't think those bad feelings are coming back. And if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I would still be at home with the covers pulled over my head, if I were still alive at all. I asked the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. I was really moved by these experiences, and I decided that I wanted to write about them, not only in a book I was working on, but also in an article. And so I got a commission from the New York Times Magazine to write about depression among the indigent. And I turned in my story, and my editor called me and said, we really can't publish this. And I said, why not? And she said, it just is too far-fetched. These people who are sort of at the very bottom rung of society, and then they get a few months of treatment, and they're virtually ready to run Morgan Stanley. It's just too implausible. She said, I've never even heard of anything like it. And I said, the fact that you've never heard of it is an indication that it is news. And you are a news magazine. So after a certain amount of negotiation, they agreed to it. But I think a lot of what they said was connected in some strange way to this distaste that people still have for the idea of treatment. The notion that somehow if we went out and treated a lot of people in indigent communities, that would be an exploitative thing to do because we would be changing them. There's this false moral imperative that seems to be all around us, that treatment of depression, the medications and so on, are an artifice and that it's not natural. And I think that's very misguided. It would be natural for people's teeth to fall out, but there is nobody militating against toothpaste, at least not in my circles. And people then say, well, but isn't depression part of what people are supposed to experience? Didn't we evolve to have depression? Isn't it part of your personality? To which I would say, mood is adaptive. Being able to have sadness and fear and joy and pleasure and all of the other moods that we have, that's incredibly valuable. And major depression is something that happens when that system gets broken. It's maladaptive. People will come to me and say, I think, though, if I just stick it out for another year, I think I can just get through this. And I always say to them, you may get through it, but you'll never be 37 again. Life is short. And that's a whole year you're talking about giving up. Think it through. It's a strange poverty of the English language, and indeed of many other languages, that we use the same word, depression, to describe how a kid feels when it rains on his birthday, and to describe how somebody feels the minute before they commit suicide. People say to me, well, is it continuous with normal sadness? And I say, in a way, it's continuous with normal sadness. There is a certain amount of continuity, but it's the same way there's continuity between having an iron fence outside your house that gets a little rust spot that you have to sort of sand off and maybe do a little repainting, and what happens if you leave the house for 100 years and it rusts through until it's only a pile of orange dust. And it's that orange dust spot, that orange dust problem, that's the one we're setting out to address. So now people say, you take these happy pills and do you feel happy? And I don't. But I don't feel sad about having to eat lunch, and I don't feel sad about my answering machine, and I don't feel sad about taking a shower. I feel more, in fact, I think, because I can feel sadness without nullity. I feel sad about professional disappointments, about damaged relationships, about global warming. Those are the things that I feel sad about now. And I said to myself, well, what is the conclusion? How did those people who have better lives, even with bigger depression, manage to get through? What is the mechanism of resilience? And what I came up with over time was that the people who deny their experience, the ones who say, I was depressed a long time ago and I never want to think about it again and I'm not going to look at it and I'm just going to get on with my life, ironically, those are the people who are most enslaved by what they have. Shutting out the depression strengthens it. While you hide from it, it grows. And the people who do better are the ones who are able to tolerate the fact that they have this condition. Those who can tolerate their depression are the ones who achieve resilience. So Frank Russakoff said to me, if I had it to do over, I suppose I wouldn't do it this way. But in a strange way, I'm grateful for what I've experienced. I'm glad to have been in the hospital 40 times. It taught me so much about love, and my relationship with my parents and my doctors has been so precious to me and will be always. And Maggie Robbins said, I used to volunteer in an AIDS clinic, and I would just talk and talk and talk. And the people I was dealing with weren't very responsive, and I thought, that's not very friendly or helpful of them. And then I realized that they weren't going to do more than make those first few minutes of small talk. It was simply going to be an occasion where I didn't have AIDS and I wasn't dying, but could tolerate the fact that they did, and they were. Our needs are our greatest assets. It turns out I've learned to give all the things I need. Valuing one's depression does not prevent a relapse, but it may make the prospect of relapse, and even relapse itself, easier to tolerate. The question is not so much of finding great meaning and deciding your depression has been very meaningful. It's of seeking that meaning and thinking when it comes again, this will be hellish, but I will learn something from it. I had learned in my own depression how big an emotion can be, how it can be more real than facts. And I have found that that experience has allowed me to experience positive emotion in a more intense and more focused way. The opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And these days, my life is vital, even on the days when I'm sad. I felt that funeral in my brain, and I sat next to the Colossus at the edge of the world. And I have discovered something inside of myself that I would have to call a soul, that I had never formulated until that day 20 years ago when hell came to pay me a surprise visit. I think that while I hated being depressed and would hate to be depressed again, I found a way to love my depression. I love it because it has forced me to find and cling to joy. I love it because each day I decide, sometimes gamely and sometimes against the moment's reason, to cleave to the reasons for living. And that, I think, is a highly privileged rapture. Thank you.
You're watching Columbus Television. Always on COLS.TV. We are streaming on the internet. Download our apps for Android and Apple iPhone and iPad. Columbus Television.
in the next 18 minutes, I'm going to take you on a journey. And it's a journey that you and I have been on for many years now, and it began some 50 years ago when humans first stepped off our planet. And in those 50 years, not only did we literally, physically set foot on the moon, but we have dispatched robotic spacecraft to all the planets, all 8 of them. And we have landed on asteroids, we have rendezvoused with comets, and at this point in time, we have a spacecraft on its way to Pluto, the body formerly known as a planet. And all these robotic missions are part of a bigger human journey, a voyage to understand something, to get a sense of our cosmic place, to understand something of our origins and how Earth, our planet, and we living on it came to be. And of all the places in the solar system that we might go to in search for answers to questions like this, there's Saturn. And we had been to Saturn before. We'd visited Saturn in the early 1980s, but our investigations of Saturn have become far more in-depth and detailed since the Cassini spacecraft, traveling across interplanetary space for 7 years, glided into orbit around Saturn in the summer of 2004 and became, at that point, the farthest robotic outpost that humanity had ever established around the sun. Now, the Saturn system is a rich planetary system. It offers mystery, scientific insight, and obviously splendor beyond compare. And the investigation of this system has enormous cosmic reach. In fact, just studying the rings alone, we stand to learn a lot about the disks of stars and gas that we call the spiral galaxies. And here's a beautiful picture of the Andromeda Nebula, which is our closest, largest spiral galaxy to the Milky Way. And then here's a beautiful composite of the Whirlpool Galaxy taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. So the journey back to Saturn is really part of and is also a metaphor for a much larger human voyage to understand the interconnectedness of everything around us and also how humans fit into that picture. And it pains me that I can't tell you all that we have learned with Cassini and I can show you all the beautiful pictures that we've taken in the last 2.5 years because I simply don't have the time. So I'm going to concentrate on 2 of the most exciting stories that have emerged out of this major exploratory expedition that we are conducting around Saturn and have been for the past 2.5 years. Saturn is accompanied by a very large and diverse collection of moons. They range in size from a few kilometers across to as big across as the US. Most of the beautiful pictures we've taken of Saturn, in fact, show Saturn in accompaniment with some of its moons. Here's Saturn with Dione, and then here's Saturn showing the rings edge on, showing you just how vertically thin they are with the moon Enceladus. Now, 2 of the 47 moons that Saturn has are standouts, and those are Titan and Enceladus. Titan is Saturn's largest moon, and until Cassini had arrived there, was the largest single expanse of unexplored terrain that we had remaining in our solar system. And it is a body that has long intrigued people who've watched the planets. It has a very large, thick atmosphere, and in fact, its surface environment was believed to be more like the environment we have here on the Earth, or at least had in the past, than any other body in the solar system. Its atmosphere is largely molecular nitrogen, like you are breathing here in this room, except that its atmosphere is suffused with simple organic materials like methane and propane and ethane. And these molecules, high up in the atmosphere of Titan, get broken down, and their products join together to make haze particles. This haze is ubiquitous. It's completely global and enveloping Titan, and that's why you cannot see down to the surface with our eyes in the visible region of the spectrum. But these haze particles, it was surmised before we got there with Cassini, over billions and billions of years, gently drifted down to the surface and coated the surface in a thick organic sludge. So like the equivalent, the Titan equivalent of tar or oil or what, we didn't know what, but this is what we suspected. And these molecules, especially methane and ethane, can be liquids at the surface temperatures of Titan. Okay, and so it turns out that methane is to Titan what water is to the Earth. It's a condensable in the atmosphere, and so recognizing this circumstance brought to the fore a whole world of bizarre possibilities. You can have methane clouds. Okay, and above those clouds you have this hundreds of kilometers of haze which prevent any sunlight from getting to the surface. The temperature at the surface is some 350 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Okay, but despite that cold, you can have rain falling down on the surface of Titan and doing on Titan what rain does on the Earth. It carves gullies, it forms rivers and cataracts, it can create canyons, it can pool in large basins and craters. Okay, it can wash this sludge off high mountain peaks and hills down into the lowlands. So stop and think for a minute. Try to imagine what the surface of Titan might look like. Okay, it's dark. High noon on Titan is as dark as deep Earth twilight on the Earth. It's cold, it's eerie, it's misty, it might be raining, and you might be standing on the shores of Lake Michigan brimming with paint thinner. Okay, that is the view that we had of the surface of Titan before we got there with Cassini. And I can tell you that what we have found on Titan, though is not the same in detail, is every bit as fascinating as that story is. And for us, it has been like the Cassini people, it has been like a Jules Verne adventure come true. As I said, it has a thick, extensive atmosphere. This is a picture of Titan backlit by the sun with the rings as a beautiful backdrop. And yet another moon there. I don't even know which one it is. It's a very extensive atmosphere. We have instruments on Cassini which can see down to the surface through this atmosphere. And my camera system is one of them. And we have taken pictures like this. And what you see is bright and dark regions. And that's about as far as it got for us. It was so mystifying. We couldn't make out what we were seeing on Titan. When you look closer at this region, you start to see things like sinuous channels. We didn't know. You see a few round things. This, we have later found out, is in fact a crater, but there's very few craters on the surface of Titan, meaning it's a very young surface. And there are features that look tectonic. They look like they've been pulled apart. Whenever you see anything linear on a planet, it means there's been a fracture, okay, like a fault. And so it's been tectonically altered, but we couldn't make sense of our images until 6 months after we got into orbit. An event occurred that many have regarded as the highlight of Cassini's investigation of Titan, and that was the deployment of the Huygens probe, the European-built Huygens probe that Cassini had carried for 7 years across the solar system. We deployed it to the atmosphere of Titan. It just took 2.5 hours to descend, and it landed on the surface. And I just want to emphasize how significant an event this is. This is a device of human making, and it landed in the outer solar system for the first time in human history. It is so significant that in my mind, this was an event that should have been celebrated with ticker tape parades in every city across the US and Europe, and sadly that wasn't the case. It was significant for another reason. This is an international mission, and this event was celebrated in Europe, in Germany. And the celebratory presentations were given in English accents and American accents and German accents and French and Italian and Dutch accents. It was a moving demonstration of what the words United Nations are supposed to mean. A true union of nations joined together in a colossal effort for good. And in this case, it was a massive undertaking to explore a planet and to come to understand a planetary system that for all of human history had been unreachable, and now humans had actually touched it. So it was, I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. It was a tremendously emotional event, and it's something that I will personally never forget, and you shouldn't either. But anyway, the probe took measurements of the atmosphere on the way down, and it also took panoramic pictures, and I can't tell you what it was like to see the first pictures of Titan's surface from the probe, and this is what we saw. And it was a shocker because it was everything we wanted those other pictures taken from orbit to be. It was an unambiguous pattern, a geological pattern. It's a dendritic drainage pattern that can be formed only by the flow of liquids. And you can follow these channels and you can see how they all converge, and they converge into this channel here, which drains into this region. You're looking at a shoreline. Was this a shoreline of fluids? We didn't know. but this is somewhat of a shoreline. This picture is taken at 16 kilometers. This is the picture taken at 8 kilometers. Okay, again, the shoreline. Okay, now 16 kilometers, 8 kilometers, this is roughly an airline altitude. If you were going to take an airplane trip across the US, you would be flying at these altitudes. So this is the picture you would have out the window of Titanian Airlines as you fly across the surface of Titan. And then finally, the probe came to rest on the surface. And I'm going to show you, ladies and gentlemen, the first picture ever taken from the surface of a moon in the outer solar system. And here is the horizon. Okay, these are probably water ice pebbles, yes? And obviously, it landed in one of these flat, dark regions, and it didn't sink out of sight. So it wasn't fluid that we landed in. Okay, what the probe came down in was basically the Titan equivalent of a mudflat. This is an unconsolidated ground that is suffused with liquid methane. Okay, and it's probably the case that this material has washed off the highlands of Titan through these channels that we saw and has drained over billions of years to fill in low-lying basins, and that is what Titan, that is what the Huygens probe landed in. But still, there was no sign in our images or even in the Huygens images of any large open bodies of fluids. Where were they? It got even more puzzling when we found dunes. Okay, so this is our movie of the equatorial region of Titan showing these dunes. Okay, these are dunes that are 100 meters tall, separated by a few kilometers, and they go on for miles and miles and miles. There's hundreds, up to 1,000 to 1,200 miles of dunes. This is the Saharan desert of Titan. Okay, it's obviously a place which is very dry, or where you wouldn't get dunes. So again, it got puzzling that there were no bodies of fluid until finally we saw lakes in the polar regions. And there is a lake seen in the South Polar region of Titan. It's about the size of Lake Ontario. And then only a week and a half ago, we flew over the North Pole of Titan and found, again, we found a feature here the size of the Caspian Sea. So it seems that the liquids, for some reason we don't understand, during at least this season, are apparently at the poles of Titan. And I think you would agree that Titan, we have found Titan is an remarkable, mystical place. It's exotic, it's alien, but yet strangely Earth-like, and having Earth-like geological formations and a tremendous geographical diversity, and is a fascinating world whose only rival in the solar system for complexity and richness is the Earth itself. And so now we go on to Enceladus. Enceladus is a small moon. It's about the 10th the size of Titan, and you could see it here next to England, just to show you the size. This is not meant to be a threat. Okay? And Enceladus is very white, it's very bright, and its surface is obviously racked with fractures. It is a very geologically active body, but the mother lode of discoveries on Enceladus was found at the South Pole, and we're looking at the South Pole here, where we found this system of fractures, and they're a different color because they're a different composition. They are coated. These fractures are coated with organic materials. Moreover, this whole entire region, okay, the South Polar region has elevated temperatures. It's the hottest place on the planet, on the body. That's as bizarre as finding that the Antarctic on the Earth is hotter than the tropics. Okay, and then when we took additional pictures, we discovered that from these fractures are issuing jets of fine icy particles extending hundreds of miles into space. And when we color code this image